Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and History, tonight's journey through time. Tonight marks the beginning of something truly ambitious, the entire history of Britain. Over the course of this series, we will follow the story of these islands as though floating gently on a current of time. We will begin here, in the deep past of the Ice Age, long before kings and queens, long before castles and cathedrals, even long before farming and villages. From there, we will move forward step by step through the raising of stone monuments, the clash of Roman legions, the arrival of Saxons and Vikings, the struggles of medieval monarchs, the blaze of the Reformation, the thunder of civil war, the dawn of industry, the sacrifice of world wars, and the shifting identities of the modern nation. It is not just the story of rulers and battles, it is the unfolding of a land, an island people, and the centuries that shaped them. But before we can understand Britain's later grandeur or its turbulent politics, we must begin in a far more fragile setting. Imagine a world of endless cold, forests and tundra stretching as far as the eye can see, rivers swollen with meltwater, and predators lurking just beyond the reach of firelight. It is a world that would test us to our limits. Without the fire-starting skills, the weapons, and the instinct of those early people, very few of us could last more than a handful of days. It is here, however, that Britain's story begins. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you do, let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into the first chapter of Britain's long story. Around 900,000 years ago, the first humans entered Britain. This was not an island yet. Instead, it was a peninsula of Europe, linked to the continent by a wide plain of marshes and rivers we now call Doggerland. Herds of mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses grazed there, while predators such as lions, hyenas, and wolves roamed freely. Following these herds came groups of hunter-gatherers, carrying crude flint hand axes chipped from stone. These tools were simple but effective, sharp enough to butcher meat, scrape hides, or carve wood. For these first Britons, survival depended on movement, fire, and cooperation. The landscape itself was restless. Great ice sheets advanced and retreated in slow cycles, sometimes covering Britain almost entirely, sometimes withdrawing and leaving fertile valleys behind. Around 700,000 years ago, the land was buried under bitter cold, silent but for the creak of glaciers and the rush of meltwater streams. People vanished for thousands of years, retreating to warmer regions of Europe. When the ice pulled back, they returned again, leaving scattered traces, tools, bones, and the faint scars of their presence across riverbeds and hills. By 400,000 years ago, their lives had grown more complex. At Boxgrove in Sussex, archaeologists uncovered wooden spears, butchered animal remains, and even footprints preserved in ancient clay. These traces show people working together in organised hunts, bringing down wild horses and carefully carving them for meat and hide. To imagine this moment is to picture the thud of hooves across an open plain, the shouts of hunters rushing forward, the throw of a spear striking true, and afterward the smoke of fire rising into the air as families gathered to eat. Yet this Britain was not empty wilderness. It was alive with creatures we would hardly believe today. Elephants with straight tusks moved through clearings, giant deer with vast antlers grazed in the forests, packs of hyenas prowled the carcasses left behind, lions larger than modern African lions stalked the valleys. To live here was to exist in constant balance, both hunter and hunted, relying on fire not just for warmth but for protection against the dark. Tens of thousands of years later, around 40,000 years ago, a new species entered the land, Homo sapiens, our own ancestors. With them came sharper blades, tailored clothing, and the beginnings of ritual and imagination. In Creswell Crags, Derbyshire, faint carvings of animals can still be seen on cave walls. Bison, birds, and horses scratched into rock. By firelight, the images would have danced and shifted with the shadows, becoming not just pictures but stories, perhaps prayers, perhaps memories of hunts, perhaps something we can only guess at. These carvings are among the earliest expressions of symbolic thought in Britain, fragile yet enduring. At the same time, Neanderthals still walked the land. For thousands of years, they may have encountered Homo sapiens, sometimes avoiding one another, sometimes competing, and perhaps, on rare occasions, meeting in ways more complex than we can fully understand. The Neanderthals left their own marks, tools, hearths, bones, and then, slowly, they disappeared, leaving only traces in the DNA of modern people. Around 12,000 years ago, the Great Ice Age came to its close. Glaciers melted, releasing torrents of water, and the valleys filled with rivers and lakes. Birch, pine, and later oak and hazel spread across the land, replacing the tundra with dense forest. Animals changed too. Red deer, wild boar, and massive aurochs now roamed the woods. For the people who remained, this was a world of abundance but also of adjustment. The land was no longer open plain. It was woodland, filled with challenges and opportunities alike. But with the retreat of the ice came another transformation. The sea began to rise. The low-lying Doggerland, once a vast bridge to Europe, flooded slowly but inexorably. Marshes became bays, rivers became estuaries, meadows vanished beneath waves. By about 8,000 years ago, Britain was cut off completely, surrounded on all sides by water. For the first time in history, Britain was an island. Isolation brought change. People crafted dugout canoes from tree trunks, hollowed and smooth to glide along rivers and coasts. They fished with sharpened bone points, gathered shellfish along tidal flats, and learned to live with the rhythm of the sea. They built more permanent camps, as at Starcar in Yorkshire, where wooden platforms lined a lake's edge. Here, antler headdresses were discovered, carved from red deer skulls, and perhaps worn in ritual dances, suggesting a deep spiritual bond with the animals that sustained them. Life was still difficult, but it was also creative, adaptive, and full of meaning. Tools were polished and refined, ornaments shaped from bone and stone, charms carried perhaps for luck or protection. Fire still crackled at the heart of each camp, its smoke rising into the forest canopy, a signal of human presence in a wild and shifting land. This is where the story of Britain truly begins. Forged by ice, defined by rising seas, and sustained by the resilience of its earliest peoples. These first Britons endured not for days or years, but for millennia, adapting again and again as the climate shifted, as the animals changed, as the very land beneath their feet transformed. Their survival laid the foundations for everything that would come next. Soon, they would raise monuments of stone against the sky, shape metal into weapons and ornaments, and form communities whose legacies still mark the soil of these islands. So picture yourself, for a moment, on a high cliff overlooking the channel. The air smells of salt and damp earth. Below you, waves roll over the drowned plains of Doggerland, hiding forever the paths where hunters once walked. Behind you, deep in the forest, a thin plume of smoke rises, curling skyward from a camp where people gather around fire. Children laugh softly, fish roast on wooden spits, and the voices of families mingle with the eternal sound of the sea. Britain has become an island, and with it begins the long, unbroken story we are about to follow together. Mysterious Stone Age. Monuments. As the Ice Age released its grip and Britain's landscape softened into forest and meadow, the people who remained on this island began to change the way they lived. For tens of thousands of years, their ancestors had wandered, following the seasons, moving with the herds, fishing rivers, and gathering what the land provided. But around 4000 BCE, something new arrived on these shores, carried across the channel by groups of early farmers from continental Europe. It was the beginning of a revolution as profound as fire itself. Agriculture. The forests were cleared in patches. Small fields open to the sunlight. Barley and wheat were planted. Domesticated animals, cattle, pigs, and sheep were tended and herded. For the first time in Britain's history, people could remain in one place, bound not only to the rhythm of the hunt, but also to the steady cycle of sowing and harvest. Communities formed, villages grew, and with permanence came a deeper relationship with the land. This shift also gave rise to something remarkable: the building of great monuments. Across Britain, from the windswept highlands of Scotland to the chalk plains of Wiltshire, stones were raised, earth was heaped into long barrows, and circles took shape against the sky. These monuments were not the work of a single year, or even a single generation. They were the projects of entire communities, labours of devotion passed down, stones carried and set by people who may never have seen the work complete. At first came the long barrows, burial mounds stretching for dozens of metres, raised over the remains of the dead. Some held entire communities, bones of men, women, and children intermingled, suggesting that death was not seen as the end of individuality, but as a merging into ancestry. To walk among these barrows today is to feel the weight of that belief, the sense that the land itself held the memory of those who had lived upon it. In time, the monuments grew more ambitious. Circles of timber were raised, posts set deep into the earth to form spaces that may have marked rituals, gatherings, or seasonal observances. Then, in a leap of imagination and determination, stone itself was chosen. At Avebury in Wiltshire, vast circles of standing stones were arranged, enclosing areas large enough for entire villages. Each stone weighed tons, dragged across miles by nothing more than ropes, rollers, and human will. Imagine the sight of hundreds of people straining together, chanting perhaps, hauling a stone up a chalk slope, setting it into place, and watching as it took its position in the circle of eternity. Most famous of all is Stonehenge. Its story begins around 3000 BCE with a simple earth bank and ditch, a circular enclosure dug with tools of antler and bone. Within a few centuries, timber posts appeared, and then the stones themselves. First, smaller blue stones brought all the way from the Preseli Hills of Wales, some 150 miles distant. Later, the Great Sarsens, massive blocks weighing up to 25 tons, were dragged from the Marlborough Downs. These were set upright, capped with lintels, and locked in place with carved joints, the precision astonishing for a people without metal tools or wheels. We do not know precisely what Stonehenge meant to those who built it. Its alignments with the solstices suggest a calendar, a place where the movements of sun and season were tracked. Its burial remains suggest it was also a place of ancestors, a monument to the dead as much as to the living. To stand within it, as the midsummer sun rises directly above the heelstone, casting its light into the heart of the circle, is to glimpse a connection between earth and sky, life and death, that has echoed across thousands of years. The building of these monuments was not simply about ritual, it was also about community. To move stones of such size, to raise timber posts, to dig ditches hundreds of feet long, this required cooperation on a scale never before seen in Britain. Entire villages must have gathered for the work, food prepared, fires lit, songs sung as the stones creaked and shifted. These moments bound people together, forging identities larger than any single family. They were no longer just groups of hunters or farmers, they were communities defined by the monuments they raised, their lives given meaning by the stones standing against the horizon. Archaeological evidence adds small but vivid details to this picture. Animal bones, discarded after feasts, show that pigs were driven from miles away to feed workers at Stonehenge. Traces of huts and hearths nearby suggest seasonal camps, great gatherings where people met not only to build but to celebrate, trade, and perhaps seek marriages or alliances. These were not lonely projects, they were festivals of labour and life, binding the scattered peoples of Britain into networks of culture and memory. And while the stones remain the most visible, other monuments tell the same story. In Orkney, at the Ring of Brodgar and the village of Skara Brae, stone structures were built with astonishing skill, homes roofed with turf, hearths burning at the centre. Here, people lived side by side, their walls decorated with carved symbols, their lives ordered by both daily survival and ceremonial rhythm. Across the island chain, tombs like Maeshowe were raised, passageways aligned with the winter solstice sun, filling the chamber with light at the darkest time of year. These places remind us that the people of Neolithic Britain were not primitive wanderers, but engineers, architects, astronomers, and storytellers. Their world was bound by cycles, the turning of the sun, the growth of crops, the birth and death of generations, and they sought to embody those cycles in stone and earth. Every mound, every circle, every carved spiral was a message across time, a declaration that they had lived, and that their lives had meaning beyond the moment. To stand among these monuments today is to feel that message still. The stones are weathered, their surfaces pitted and scarred by millennia of wind and rain, yet they remain upright, patient, silent, their purpose not diminished by the loss of memory. Crows perch on their tops, sheep graze at their bases, and tourists trace hands across their rough faces. Still, they keep their secrets. The Neolithic Age of Britain was not an age of cities or empires. It was an age of fields, hearths, and circles of stone. It was a time when life was fragile, when winters could be harsh, when harvests could fail. Yet it was also a time of immense creativity, when people turned survival into culture, when they raised monuments that outlasted them by thousands of years. And as we move forward into the ages of bronze and iron, into the arrival of new technologies and new peoples, these stones will remain in the background, silent witnesses to change. They remind us that Britain's story is not just one of wars and rulers, but of communities gathered in the landscape, shaping meaning out of earth, wood, and stone. So, imagine, as the chapter closes, the midsummer sun breaking the horizon. A circle of stones stands before you, their shadows long on the grass. People gather, their faces turned to the light, their voices rising in chant or song. The sun lifts, the earth warms, and for a brief moment, land, sky, and people are one. This was Neolithic Britain, rooted in the land, bound by community, and forever reaching for meaning in the rhythm of the seasons. Bronze Age tribes thrive. By around 2500 BCE, Britain was shifting once again. The great stone monuments of the Neolithic still stood, their circles and barrows rooted in the earth, but new arrivals brought with them tools and traditions that would reshape the island. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was being worked, and with it came not only stronger weapons and sharper tools, but also entirely new ways of living. The Bronze Age had begun, and across Britain, its people entered a period of profound transformation. The first to bring bronze working were groups often called the Beaker people, named for their distinctive pottery, shaped like tall drinking vessels with geometric designs. These newcomers likely arrived from continental Europe around 2500 BCE, spreading across Britain within a few centuries. They carried with them knowledge of metal smelting, burial practices, and forms of social organization different from the Neolithic farmers who had raised the great stone monuments. Their presence did not erase what came before, but slowly, old traditions blended with new. The monumental age of giant stone circles began to wane, while bronze, wealth, and status became increasingly important. Bronze offered clear advantages. Where flint tools dulled quickly, bronze blades could be sharpened again and again. Axes cut wood with greater ease, opening forests for fields. Spears and swords gave hunters, and later warriors, new strength. With this new material came trade, for bronze required both copper and tin, metals not always found in the same place. Cornwall's rich veins of tin became especially prized, linking Britain into far-reaching trade networks that extended into Europe and even the Mediterranean. The island, once isolated by rising seas, was now connected again by ships carrying ores, ingots, beads, and pottery. The people of Bronze Age Britain also developed new ways of honouring their dead. Where Neolithic barrows had often contained whole communities together, Bronze Age burials became more personal. Individual graves were dug, sometimes with the body crouched and accompanied by grave goods, pots, ornaments, weapons, or tools. These burials suggest a growing sense of personal identity, of wealth and status carried into the afterlife. In Wessex, richly furnished graves contained gold ornaments, amber beads, and finely crafted bronze weapons. revealing a society where certain individuals stood above the rest, chiefs or leaders whose influence extended across wide regions. Archaeologists call one such figure the Amesbury Archer discovered near Stonehenge. Buried around 2300 BCE, he was laid to rest with more than 100 objects, including copper knives, gold ornaments, stone wrist guards, and the tools of a metal worker. His grave is one of the richest from this era in Europe, and his very presence near Stonehenge suggests a continuity between the old sacred landscape and the new age of bronze. Here was a man of power and skill, whose life straddled the traditions of stone and the promise of metal. Communities in the Bronze Age were no longer bound to monumental projects on the same scale as before. Instead, they turned inward, focusing on farming, craft, and trade. Settlements grew across the countryside. Clusters of roundhouses with thatched roofs, smoke rising from hearths, and animals penned nearby. The roundhouse became the symbol of domestic life, its circular walls sheltering families from the wind, its central fire a place for warmth, cooking, and gathering. The sound of bronze being hammered, the clatter of cattle, the laughter of children, the rhythm of grinding grain, these filled the daily life of Britain's Bronze Age. This was also an age of travel and connection. Rivers became highways, and coastal routes linked communities. Carts may have rolled across rough tracks, pulled by oxen. People carried goods and stories, ideas and fashions, binding Britain into a broader world. Gold ornaments and amber beads hint at long-distance exchange, while carvings of ships on rocks in Scotland suggest that seafaring was becoming an essential part of life. Yet even in this age of bronze, the sacred remained important. Stone circles continued to be built, though often smaller than their Neolithic predecessors. Rituals still marked the passing of the seasons, the honouring of ancestors, and the mysteries of life and death. Fires burned on hilltops, burial mounds dotted the landscape, and offerings were cast into rivers and bogs. Bronze swords, bent deliberately before being lowered into the water, symbols of sacrifice to unseen powers. The land itself carried weight and belief. Hills, rivers, and springs were sacred, their spirits honoured with gifts. To live in Bronze Age Britain was to walk a landscape alive with meaning, every mound and grove touched by story, every tool or weapon carrying both practical and spiritual value. By the later Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE, communities were growing larger and defences began to appear. Hillforts, settlements built on high ground with ditches and ramparts, suggest that competition and conflict were becoming more common. Chiefs vied for control of trade routes, herds, and fertile land. Bronze swords and spears were not only for hunting but for battle. While we should not imagine constant war, we can sense that the balance of power mattered, and that leadership required both wealth and the ability to protect it. Still, life was not only about conflict. Most days were spent tending animals, grinding grain, weaving cloth, or shaping tools. Seasonal festivals marked harvest and planting, drawing communities together with feasts, music, and fire. Children grew up within the circles of roundhouses, watching the glow of the hearth, learning the skills of their parents. Life was hard, but it was full, woven into the cycles of nature and the bonds of kinship. As the Bronze Age drew to a close, change was stirring again. New peoples and ideas from the continent brought iron, a metal stronger and more plentiful than bronze. Hillforts would grow larger, societies more stratified, and Britain would move into another new chapter of its history. But before that, for more than 1,000 years, the Bronze Age had shaped the island into a land of farmers, traders, smiths, and warriors. Its fields tilled, its rivers crossed, its monuments still standing silent as witnesses to the lives of those who built them. So picture, as the chapter ends, a Bronze Age village at dusk. Smoke rises from roundhouses, the smell of roasting meat drifting into the air. A smith hammers bronze at his anvil, sparks flying into the twilight. Children chase one another across the settlement's edge. Beyond the fields, a circle of burial mounds catches the last light of the sun, silent reminders of ancestors watching from the earth. This was Bronze Age Britain, practical, inventive, rooted in the land, and ever reaching outward through trade and story. The next age, the Iron Age, waited just beyond the horizon. Iron Age Hillforts rise. By around 800 BCE, Britain entered the Iron Age. The mastery of iron transformed the island's societies, bringing both new opportunities and new tensions. Iron ore was more widely available than the copper and tin needed for bronze, and the metal itself was stronger and could be fashioned into sharper, more durable tools and weapons. With this new technology, daily life shifted once again. Iron axes cleared more woodland for farming, creating fields where cereals were sown and animals were grazed. Iron sickles harvested crops more efficiently, and ploughs drawn by oxen deepened the soil, allowing larger harvests. Communities grew, supported by steadier food supplies. Pottery became more refined, used for storage and cooking. Textiles, woven from wool and plant fibers, were spun into garments. The archaeological record reveals settlements across hills, valleys, and plains villages of timber roundhouses with thatched roofs, smoke rising from hearths, surrounded by enclosures for livestock. It was in this period that hillforts appeared across the landscape. These were fortified settlements, built on elevated ground and surrounded by ditches and banks. At first, some may have been built as symbols of prestige or gathering places for trade, but over time many became defensive strongholds. Hillforts such as Maiden Castle in Dorset, Danebury in Hampshire, and Traprainlaw in Scotland grew into centres of regional power. They were not cities in the sense of later ages, but they acted as hubs, places of refuge, storage, craft, and authority. Within their ramparts, communities lived, worked, and gathered during times of threat. The societies of Iron Age Britain were tribal, organised into kin-based groups led by chieftains. These leaders drew their strength from control of land, herds, and trade. They also displayed their status through material wealth, finely crafted swords, decorated shields, torques of gold or bronze worn around the neck, and elaborate feasts that reinforced bonds of loyalty. Archaeological finds from burials show the prestige of warriors and leaders, interred with weapons, ornaments, and sometimes chariots. Farming remained the core of daily life. Cattle, sheep, and pigs provided meat, hides, and wool. Horses were increasingly valued, both for transport and as symbols of status. Grain was stored in pits or granaries, protected within hillforts or settlements. The countryside was dotted with field systems, boundaries marked by ditches, banks, and hedges. Over centuries, the landscape itself was reshaped, becoming more domesticated, more controlled by human hands. Religion and ritual remained central, though their exact forms are only glimpsed through archaeology. Offerings of weapons and ornaments were cast into rivers, lakes, and bogs, suggesting that water was sacred. Hilltops and groves may have been sites of worship. Shrines and wooden idols have been uncovered, hinting at a spiritual world where natural forces were honoured and appeased. The dead were treated in varied ways, some buried with goods, others exposed to the elements, their bones later gathered and placed in special contexts. These practices suggest beliefs that tied people to both the cycles of nature and the presence of ancestors. Trade networks linked Iron Age Britain to the wider world. Goods moved across land and sea, iron, salt, and slaves exchanged for wine, glass, and luxury items from Gaul and the Mediterranean. Archaeological discoveries of amphorae, large clay vessels for wine, reveal that imported drink was consumed at the feasts of elite leaders. These connections tied Britain into the currents of continental Europe, influencing its cultures and introducing new ideas. Art and craft flourished in this period, known as Latin culture, after finds in Switzerland, but reflected strongly in Britain. Metalwork was decorated with flowing, abstract patterns of spirals and curves. Shields, helmets, cauldrons, and jewellery carried intricate designs, symbols of both identity and artistry. The famous Battersea shield, dredged from the Thames, displays this tradition with polished bronze and red enamel. Such objects were not only practical, but expressions of status and belief, placed in rivers as offerings, or carried in life as markers of distinction. Conflict was never absent. The construction of hillforts, the presence of weapons in burials, and the defences around settlements all point to competition for land, resources, and power. Raids and skirmishes likely occurred, though not the large-scale wars of later history. Leadership required both strength in arms and the ability to gather followers to reward loyalty with feasts and protection. The warrior, armed with iron sword and shield, became a central figure in society, honoured in life and remembered in death. By the later centuries of the Iron Age, especially after about 200 BCE, Britain was divided into many tribes, each with its own territory, leadership, and identity. Names recorded later by the Romans, such as the Iceni, the Trinovantes, and the Brigantes, speak of this fragmented political landscape. Yet, despite their differences, these groups shared common ways of life: farming, hillforts, warrior elites, and connections through trade and ritual. As the 1st century BCE approached, Britain stood at a crossroads. Its tribes were prosperous, its fields fertile, its trade connections strong. Hillforts crowned the hills, ornaments gleamed, and rituals bound people to land and ancestry. But beyond the Channel, a power was rising that would soon reshape Britain completely. Roman eyes were turning northward, and the island's age of hillforts and tribal kings was nearing its end. Roman conquest arrives. In the middle of the 1st century BCE, the island of Britain was not unknown to the wider world. Traders had long crossed the Channel, exchanging goods, stories, and ideas between the peoples of Gaul and the tribes of southern Britain. Roman merchants carried wine, fine pottery, and glass in exchange for British metals, cattle, grain, and slaves. Britain was already part of Rome's economic orbit before it ever became part of the empire. The first direct Roman encounter came in 55 BCE, when Julius Caesar launched an expedition across the Channel. His motive was partly military, partly political. He wanted to punish tribes in Britain who had supported resistance in Gaul, and he wanted to enhance his reputation in Rome. Caesar's landings were brief, hampered by weather, tides, and fierce resistance from coastal tribes. His campaigns in 55 and 54 BCE did not lead to conquest, but they provided Rome with valuable knowledge of the island and its peoples. He described Britain as divided into many tribes, each ruled by its own kings and leaders, and noted the fierce chariots of British warriors, who drove into battle with skill and speed. For nearly a century afterward, Rome did not attempt another invasion. Britain remained outside the empire, though its trade with the continent continued. Tribal rulers in the south grew wealthy through this exchange, adopting some Roman goods and fashions. By the early 1st century CE, coins minted by British kings reveal names such as Cunobelinus, remembered later in Shakespeare's plays. These rulers balanced independence with contact, maintaining their authority while acknowledging Rome's shadow just across the sea. Conquest came in 43 CE under Emperor Claudius. The reasons were complex. Claudius, who had recently taken the throne, needed a military success to secure his legitimacy. Britain offered a prize, a wealthy land beyond the empire's northern frontier, known to Romans but never subdued. The invasion force was large, 4 legions supported by auxiliary troops, cavalry, and a fleet. They crossed the Channel and landed in the southeast, advancing inland against British tribes. Resistance was fierce. The Cativaloni and their allies fought to defend their lands. Battles raged, but the Roman legions, drilled and disciplined, advanced with relentless efficiency, their shields locked, their spears thrust forward, their cavalry sweeping flanks. The tribes fought bravely with chariots and warriors, but they could not withstand Rome's heavy infantry and organised formations. Within months, Roman forces captured key centres and pushed deeper into the island. Claudius himself came to Britain, though only briefly, to accept the surrender of tribes and to mark the conquest with ceremony. His arrival symbolised Rome's authority and the incorporation of Britain into the empire. A triumph was later celebrated in Rome, with elephants paraded through the streets, said to have been used in the campaign. The conquest did not mean instant control of the whole island. Roman rule spread gradually. In the south and east, many tribes submitted or allied with Rome, finding advantage in cooperation. Roman towns began to appear, such as Camulodunum, modern Colchester, the first capital of Roman Britain. Roads were laid out, connecting military forts and settlements, cutting straight lines through countryside that had once known only winding tracks. Yet resistance simmered. In Wales, the Cilias and Ordovices fought prolonged campaigns against Roman legions. In the north, tribes like the Brigantes were restive, sometimes allied with Rome, sometimes hostile. The conquest was not complete in a single generation. It was a long process of battles, treaties, and uprisings. The most famous revolt erupted in 60 CE under the leadership of Boudica, queen of the Iceni. After the death of her husband, the Romans mistreated her family and seized her tribe's lands. Enraged, Boudica gathered allies and raised a massive rebellion. Her forces destroyed Roman towns, including Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium, killing thousands. For a moment, Roman control seemed on the edge of collapse, but the governor, Suetonius Paulinus, regrouped his troops and met Boudica's army in battle. The Roman discipline and tactics prevailed, crushing the rebellion. Boudica's fate is uncertain. Some sources say she took her own life to avoid capture, others that she fell ill and died. Her revolt, however, became legendary, remembered as a symbol of defiance against foreign rule. Despite such resistance, Rome entrenched its power. Forts and roads expanded across the countryside. Settlements grew into towns with forums, temples, and baths. The military presence remained heavy, especially along frontiers and in areas prone to rebellion. Roman Britain became both a province of the empire and a frontier zone, where legions guarded against northern tribes and against unrest within. The conquest marked a profound change in Britain's history. Tribes that had once lived in independent hillforts now found themselves under a distant but powerful authority. Land was reorganized, wealth was taxed, and Roman ways of life began to filter through. For some, cooperation brought wealth and new opportunities. For others, the conquest meant loss, subjugation, and struggle. The Iron Age world of hillforts and tribal kings was not gone overnight, but it had been set on a path that would soon transform the island's culture, economy, and identity. By the middle of the 1st century CE, Britain was firmly within Rome's grasp. Its conquest had cost battles, blood, and rebellion, but the legions had prevailed. What came next was not merely occupation, but centuries of integration into an empire that stretched from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Germany, from Spain to the Near East. Britain was no longer just an island on the edge of the known world. It was now Rome's newest province, and its future would be shaped by the roads, cities, laws, and soldiers of the empire. Life in Roman Britain. With the conquest secured and the legions settled, Britain entered nearly 4 centuries of Roman rule. From the arrival of Claudius's armies in 43 CE to the withdrawal of Roman authority in the early 5th century, the island became one of the empire's outer provinces. Its people, landscapes, and cultures were reshaped by Roman administration, trade, and military presence. Yet beneath the veneer of Roman order, older traditions continued, and life varied greatly depending on where one lived, whether in a villa, a town, a hill fort, or a distant frontier. Roman Britain was at first a military province. Fortresses and forts were built across the land, each linked by roads laid with remarkable precision. These roads cut straight across valleys and hills, designed for speed of movement. They connected legionary bases such as York, Eboracum, Chester, Diva, and Caerleon, Isca, where thousands of soldiers were stationed. Alongside them stretched smaller forts for auxiliary troops recruited from across the empire, cavalry from Spain, archers from Syria, infantry from Gaul. The army not only secured Roman power, but also spread Roman culture into the countryside. For wherever the legions settled, merchants, craftsmen, and families soon followed. Towns began to grow, some built on the sites of earlier tribal centres, others entirely new. Londinium, established on the banks of the Thames, quickly became the province's commercial hub. Its river access made it a gateway for trade, and goods from across the empire flowed into its markets. Wine from Gaul, oil from Spain, glass from the Rhineland, spices from the east. Forums, basilicas and baths rose at its centre, reflecting the standard features of Roman urban life. Elsewhere, towns such as Verulamium, Corinium and Camulodunum became centres of administration and culture. For the wealthy, the villa emerged as a symbol of Roman influence. These country estates dotted the southern countryside, especially in fertile regions. Villas were more than simple farmhouses. They were complexes of buildings, sometimes with mosaics, hypercaust, underfloor heating, and decorative gardens. They produced grain, livestock, and wool, much of it destined for trade. Villas reveal how local elites adapted to Roman life, adopting Roman customs while managing estates worked by local labourers. The mosaics found at places like Fishbourne or Chedworth depict scenes of mythology, hunting, and intricate patterns, evidence of both prosperity and cultural blending. Religion also transformed. The Romans brought their gods with them. Jupiter, Mars, Minerva, and others had temples across the towns. At the same time, local deities were absorbed, often merged with Roman counterparts. For example, Sulis, a Celtic goddess associated with healing waters, became identified with Minerva, and a great temple was built at Bath, Aquae Sulis, around her sacred springs. Shrines and altars dedicated by soldiers show a mix of Roman, Celtic, and even Eastern deities, reflecting the diversity of the empire's peoples. Later, Christianity began to spread, reaching Britain by the 3rd century, though it remained one belief among many, until the empire itself embraced it more widely. The lives of ordinary people, however, remained rooted in agriculture. Most Britons lived not in villas or towns, but in farmsteads and villages, tending fields of wheat and barley, herding sheep and cattle, gathering from forests and rivers. They paid taxes to Rome, often in grain or livestock, supporting both the provincial administration and the distant empire. Some benefited from new tools, pottery, and markets, but for many, daily life was a continuation of older rhythms under a new authority. The Roman presence was most visible in the south and east, where towns and villas flourished. Further north and west, the landscape remained wilder, with fewer signs of urban life. Here, the legions maintained a heavy presence, especially along the northern frontier. In the 2nd century, under Emperor Hadrian, the Romans built a massive wall stretching across northern Britain from coast to coast. Hadrian's Wall, begun around 122 CE, was a monumental frontier. Stone walls, ditches, forts, and watchtowers running for nearly 80 miles. It marked the northern edge of Roman power, separating the controlled province from the lands of tribes beyond. Soldiers garrisoned along the wall kept watch, patrolling the frontier, engaging in skirmishes, and regulating trade and movement. Life along the wall was a mixture of military routine and cultural exchange. Inscriptions carved into stone record the names of units and commanders, altars to gods, and even personal messages. At Vindolanda, near the wall, wooden tablets have preserved extraordinary details of daily life. Requests for supplies, letters to families, even an invitation to a birthday party. These fragments show the human side of Roman Britain, the lives of soldiers and their families, the blending of cultures at the empire's edge. Roman Britain was not free of conflict. Uprisings flared, especially in frontier regions, and the legions were kept busy. Beyond Hadrian's Wall, the Romans pushed further north under Antoninus Pius, building another frontier line known as the Antonine Wall in Scotland. But it was abandoned after a generation, and Hadrian's Wall remained the enduring boundary. In Wales and northern England, resistance from local tribes persisted, requiring campaigns to secure control. The province was never entirely peaceful, but the Roman system held. Economically, Britain became a valuable part of the empire. Its mines produced lead, iron, and tin. Its farms provided grain, wool, and cattle. Trade routes connected its ports to Gaul and beyond. Coins minted in Britain reveal the integration of the island into imperial commerce. with emperors' faces circulating in markets and towns. The wealth of some villas and towns testifies to the prosperity that Roman connections could bring. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, Roman Britain had developed a distinctly provincial character. Towns had walls and forums, villas spread across the countryside. Christianity was gaining ground, and the legions maintained the frontiers. Yet beneath this Roman surface, older traditions endured. Many rural communities remained only partly Romanized, keeping Celtic languages and customs alive. The province was diverse, a blend of Roman structures and native resilience. As the empire itself weakened under external pressures and internal strife, Roman Britain grew vulnerable. By the early 5th century, legions were withdrawn to defend Rome's heartlands. Local leaders were left to manage as best they could. The villas declined, towns shrank, and the infrastructure of Roman rule slowly crumbled. But for nearly 4 centuries, Britain had been part of Rome, and the imprint of that era remained. Roads, towns, and walls endured, shaping the landscape long after the legions departed. Roman Britain was therefore a mixture of conquest and cooperation, change and continuity. It was an island tied into an empire that stretched across 3 continents, yet also a frontier where cultures blended and conflict simmered. Its legacy was profound, providing Britain with roads, towns, written records, and new beliefs. When Rome withdrew, the island did not return simply to what it had been before. The centuries of Roman rule had left a foundation upon which the next chapters of its history would be built. Saxon shores beckon. When the legions withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, the province they left behind was vulnerable and fragmented. For nearly 4 centuries, Rome had maintained order with its army, tax system, and network of towns and villas. Without the empire's support, local leaders were forced to fend for themselves. Roman walls still stood, Roman coins still circulated, but the political and military framework had collapsed. Britain was left to face its challenges without the power that had bound it to the wider world. The decline of Roman authority was gradual. Soldiers stationed in Britain were recalled to fight in other parts of the empire, leaving garrisons undermanned. Administrators lost their connection to imperial centres. Villas and towns began to deteriorate, trade routes weakened, and coins became scarce. Archaeological evidence shows villas abandoned or repurposed, towns shrinking, and rural life returning to simpler patterns. Christianity, introduced in the Roman period, survived in some areas, but churches often lacked the resources to flourish. Into this weakened landscape came new pressures. From the north, Pictish raiders crossed Hadrian's Wall and struck into former Roman territory. From the west, groups from Ireland raided into Wales and western Britain. And from the east, across the North Sea, came seaborne raiders, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. These Germanic peoples from what is now northern Germany and Denmark were skilled sailors and warriors, their longboats cutting across the Channel and along the coasts of Britain. At first, they came as raiders, striking settlements, seizing wealth, and leaving again. Over time, however, they came to settle. Some traditions suggest that local rulers in Britain invited these groups as mercenaries to help defend against other raiders. If so, the arrangement soon slipped out of control. By the mid-5th century, Anglo-Saxon groups were establishing footholds in the east and south of Britain. Settlements grew, and new waves of migrants crossed the sea. Archaeological finds of pottery, weaponry, and burial practices show a steady influx of Germanic culture into the landscape. The arrival of the Saxons and their kin transformed Britain's identity. Roman towns dwindled further, while new villages emerged in different patterns. Anglo-Saxon houses were built of timber, often sunken into the ground, grouped around small communities. Fields were cleared, animals grazed, and farming became the backbone of survival. The organisation of land shifted, with tribal leaders carving territories out of what had once been a Roman province. Language also changed. The Latin spoken in Roman towns faded, replaced in many regions by Old English, the Germanic tongue brought by the newcomers. Over centuries, this language would develop into the foundation of modern English. But in these early years, it marked a sharp break from the Roman past. Place names of Anglo-Saxon origin spread across the map, revealing the depth of settlement and transformation. Burial practices reflect these cultural shifts. Anglo-Saxon graves often included weapons, jewelry, and ornaments, marking both status and identity. Cemeteries with rows of burials reveal communities organized under leaders who displayed their power through goods placed with the dead. At Sutton Hoo in Suffolk, the burial of a king or great leader was carried out with extraordinary wealth. A ship hauled inland, filled with treasures, helmets, weapons, silver, and Byzantine bowls, then buried beneath a great mound. Though the exact identity of the figure remains debated, the burial demonstrates the connections of Anglo-Saxon elites not only across Britain, but with distant lands. Christianity, once spread under Roman rule, struggled in some areas but persisted in others, especially in the west and north. In the coming centuries, missionaries from Ireland and the continent would reintroduce and expand the faith. In the meantime, Anglo-Saxon religion honoured gods such as Woden, Thuno, and Ti, deities of war, sky, and fate. Shrines and rituals were conducted in sacred groves and by natural features. The religious landscape was varied, with Christianity holding on in some communities, while pagan practices spread in others. By the 6th century, Britain was no longer a unified province, but a patchwork of emerging Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, alongside surviving British territories in Wales, Cornwall, and the north. These kingdoms, known later as the Heptarchy, included Kent, Sussex, Wessex, Essex, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. Each was ruled by its own kings, some little more than war leaders, others with broader authority. Alliances shifted, wars were frequent, and power was always contested. The transformation of Britain after Rome was not immediate collapse but a long reshaping. Roman towns, villas, and roads remained as ruins or adapted structures, reminders of a world now past. Fields continued to be tilled, but under new leadership and new cultures, old tribal identities mixed with Anglo-Saxon settlement, producing a society that was both fragmented and dynamic. The Saxon shores, once patrolled by Roman forts to repel seaborne raiders, now became the very entry points for those who would shape the island's future. The eastern coasts filled with settlements, farms, and burial grounds. Leaders consolidated power, and the outlines of new kingdoms took form. Britain had moved from Roman province to a land of tribal kings and warrior elites. Its story had entered another era, one of change, contest, and the laying of foundations for what would eventually become England. Viking raids begin. By the close of the 8th century, the kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon Britain had become established powers. Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, and East Anglia, among others, were ruled by kings who commanded warriors, levied tribute, and sought dominance over their rivals. Christianity had spread widely, bringing with it monasteries, churches, and connections to the wider world of Europe. Yet even as these kingdoms grew in power, a new threat appeared from the sea. The first recorded Viking raid on Britain took place in 793 CE, when longships from Scandinavia struck the monastery of Lindisfarne, off the coast of Northumbria. Chroniclers described the attack with horror, noting that sacred relics were scattered, monks slain or enslaved, and treasures seized. To contemporaries, it seemed as though the very order of the world had been shattered. Holy places violated by sudden violence from the sea. This event is often marked as the beginning of the Viking Age in Britain. The raiders came from Norway, Denmark, and later Sweden. They were seafarers, skilled in navigating both open seas and shallow rivers in their sleek longships. Their motives were varied. Some came to raid for wealth, silver, gold, livestock, and slaves. Others sought new lands to settle, driven by population pressures, political rivalries, or opportunities abroad. The wealth of Britain's monasteries, filled with ornate manuscripts, chalices, and relics, made tempting targets. Over the following decades, raids increased. Coastal monasteries such as Jarrow and Iona suffered attacks. Towns and villages along rivers and estuaries were struck, their goods carried off to Scandinavia. The raids were swift and unpredictable, striking fear into communities. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a record of events kept by monks, frequently noted the appearance of heathen men and the devastation they brought. By the mid-9th century, the pattern of raiding had shifted toward conquest and settlement. Large Viking armies, sometimes called the Great Heathen Army, arrived not just to plunder, but to seize territory. In 865 CE, this force landed in East Anglia and began a campaign across the kingdoms of England. The army, composed of warriors from Denmark and Norway, moved with formidable speed and organisation. East Anglia submitted, Northumbria was attacked, and its city of York taken in 866. Mercia was pressured into submission, leaving Wessex as the strongest remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdom. The arrival of such forces reshaped the map of Britain. Large parts of the east and north fell under Viking control, an area later known as the Danelaw. Here, Scandinavian law, customs, and settlement patterns took root. Place names with endings such as by and Thorpe still mark these areas today, evidence of Viking influence. Farms, villages, and towns were established by settlers who came not only to fight, but to stay. Conflict with the Vikings was constant. Kings were forced to adapt to new forms of warfare. Monasteries and churches fortified themselves or were abandoned. Alliances shifted as some Anglo-Saxon rulers sought to resist, while others made treaties or paid tribute, known as danegeld, to buy temporary peace. The struggle was not merely military but cultural, as Christianity confronted pagan traditions, and Anglo-Saxon customs mingled with Scandinavian ones. Despite the violence, this period was also one of exchange. The Vikings brought new technologies, shipbuilding methods, and artistic styles. Trade expanded, linking Britain more firmly to Scandinavia, Ireland, and the wider North Sea world. Coins minted under Viking rulers bore both Christian and pagan symbols. Artifacts reveal a blending of styles, brooches, weapons, and carvings that combined Anglo-Saxon patterns with Norse designs. The persistence of Viking attacks and settlements forced the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to strengthen themselves. Wessex, under leaders such as King Alfred the Great, would rise in resistance. Alfred reorganised the military, constructed fortified towns known as burhs, and established a navy to challenge Viking ships. His reign marked a turning point, as Anglo-Saxon resistance slowed Viking expansion and began to reclaim lands. By the late 9th century, the struggle between Anglo-Saxons and Vikings defined Britain. The Danelaw persisted in the north and east, while Wessex consolidated power in the south. The boundaries between these regions were marked not only by political control, but also by cultural influence, law codes, language, and settlement patterns differing between Anglo-Saxon and Viking lands. The Viking Age did not end quickly. Raids and invasions continued into the 10th and 11th centuries, culminating in the rule of Danish kings over all England for a time. Yet the initial raids, beginning with Lindisfarne and spreading into full-scale conquest, marked a profound shift. Britain was no longer only a land of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. It had become part of the wider Viking world, tied by war, settlement, and trade to Scandinavia and beyond. The legacy of the Viking raids was lasting. They brought destruction to monasteries and towns, but they also reshaped political power, encouraged military innovation, and left cultural imprints still visible centuries later. Britain had entered a new age of challenge and transformation, one in which the clash between Anglo-Saxon resilience and Viking ambition would shape the path of its kingdoms for generations to come. Viking raids begin. By the late 8th century, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Britain had taken firm shape. In the north, Northumbria stretched from the Humber to the Firth of Forth, its monasteries renowned for learning and art. In the Midlands, Mercia dominated with powerful kings like Offa, who raised the great earthwork known as Offa's Dyke to mark the border with Wales. In the south, Wessex and Kent grew in influence, while East Anglia occupied the eastern fenlands. Christianity had spread across these kingdoms, weaving them into the networks of European Christendom. Monasteries served as centres of scholarship, producing illuminated manuscripts, educating elites, and preserving the memory of the Roman world that had vanished 3 centuries before. Yet even as these kingdoms strengthened, a new danger appeared across the horizon. From the fjords of Norway, the flat coasts of Denmark, and the islands of the Baltic came seafarers who would redefine Britain's destiny. The Vikings. Their ships cut swiftly across seas, shallow-drafted and sturdy, able to travel on rivers as well as open water. Their warriors carried axes, spears, and shields, clad in tunics and cloaks rather than heavy armour, relying on speed and ferocity. Their motives were mixed: wealth to be gained, land to be seized, fame to be won, and sometimes exile or hardship at home that pushed them outward. The first recorded raid came in 793 CE at Lindisfarne, a monastery off the coast of Northumbria. It was a place of prayer, learning, and pilgrimage, famous for producing the Lindisfarne Gospels, one of the most beautiful manuscripts of the early medieval world. On a June day, longships appeared, and warriors stormed ashore. The monks had no defences against armed men. Treasures were looted, relics desecrated, and the monastery left in flames. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the horror, describing heathen men bringing destruction to a holy island. To contemporaries, it seemed like an omen of divine punishment, a sign that the end of days might be near. Other monasteries soon suffered the same fate. Jarrow, the great seat of learning where the monk Bede had written his history, was attacked. Iona in Scotland, famous for its missionaries, was raided. Coastal settlements, rich with livestock and goods, became targets. The pattern was devastatingly effective. Swift raids launched with little warning, the attackers striking, seizing, and retreating before resistance could gather. These early Viking incursions terrified communities that had known relative stability under Christian kings. But these were not isolated events. Across Europe, Viking raids spread. From Ireland to France, from the Low Countries to Spain, longships appeared on coasts and rivers. Britain was part of this wider wave of expansion. Scandinavian society itself was changing. Population growth, competition among chieftains, and opportunities for wealth abroad pushed warriors across the seas. The riches of monasteries, often unwalled and filled with gold and silver vessels, provided tempting plunder. By the mid-9th century, the raids escalated into full-scale invasions. In 865 CE, what chroniclers called the Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia. Unlike earlier raiding parties, this was a coalition of many warbands, numbering in the thousands. It came not only to loot, but to conquer and settle. Led by figures such as Halfdan Ragnarsson and Ivar the Boneless, the army moved systematically across the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. East Anglia submitted quickly, its king forced to provide horses and supplies. Northumbria fell into turmoil as rival claimants fought, and York was seized in 866, becoming a Viking stronghold. Mercia faced pressure and was compelled to make peace. The sheer scale of the great heathen army changed the balance of power. No longer could Viking attacks be dismissed as passing raids. They were campaigns of conquest. Large swathes of eastern and northern England fell under Scandinavian control, forming what came to be called the Danelaw. Within this zone, Norse law, language, and customs were established alongside Anglo-Saxon traditions. Archaeological evidence reveals Scandinavian farmsteads, tools, and burial practices appearing in these regions. Place names still bear their imprint. Settlements ending in by, farm, thorp, village, and thwaite, clearing, spread across Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and beyond. The cultural impact was profound. Old English absorbed Norse vocabulary, particularly in everyday speech. Words for sky, egg, husband, and law reflect this mingling. Coins, minted under Viking rulers, bore both Christian crosses and pagan symbols, reflecting a blending of belief and identity. Towns such as York, known to the Norse as Jorvik, became centres of trade, craftsmanship, and governance under Viking control. Excavations in York have uncovered combs, jewellery and tools, showing a thriving settlement of artisans and merchants. Conflict, however, remained constant. Viking armies pushed deep into Anglo-Saxon territories, while kings struggled to resist. The chronicle records battles, shifting alliances, and the devastation of campaigns. In East Anglia, King Edmund resisted and was captured. He was later remembered as a martyr and saint. In Northumbria, rival kings fought under Viking dominance. Mercia's rulers struggled to maintain autonomy, sometimes siding with the invaders, sometimes resisting. For the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the greatest threat was to Wessex, the last kingdom to maintain independence. Under King Alfred, resistance stiffened, but before his rise, Wessex faced serious pressure. Viking armies launched repeated campaigns, seizing towns and fortresses, wintering in the heart of Anglo-Saxon lands rather than returning to Scandinavia. The pattern of settlement became clear. The Vikings were no longer visitors, but part of Britain's fabric. Beyond conquest, the Vikings integrated themselves into the wider life of Britain. Some intermarried with local populations, creating blended communities. Others established farms and trade routes, connecting Britain to Scandinavia, Ireland, and beyond. Dublin became a major Viking centre, linking the Irish Sea World with the Danelaw. Goods flowed across these networks: silver, slaves, wool, and livestock exchanged for weapons, textiles, and ornaments. Religious tension also marked this period. Christianity was deeply rooted in Anglo-Saxon England, while many Viking settlers remained pagan. Temples to Norse gods are less visible archaeologically, but sagas and later sources describe sacrifices and rituals. Over time, however, conversion spread, as Viking leaders adopted Christianity to strengthen alliances with local rulers and the church. Baptism became a political act, binding conquerors into the Christian world. The legacy of Viking raids and settlements was destructive, yet creative. Monasteries and towns were burned, but new centres of trade and culture emerged under Norse control. Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were weakened, but in resisting, they developed stronger forms of leadership and defence. The Vikings became both destroyers and settlers, enemies and neighbours. By the end of the 9th century, the map of Britain had been transformed. The Danelaw covered much of the north and east. Wessex remained independent in the south, and Wales and Scotland pursued their own paths amid the turmoil. The stage was set for a period of contest that would define the future of England. The struggle between the Anglo-Saxons who sought to preserve their kingdoms and the Viking rulers who carved new ones. The Viking Age in Britain had begun with sudden raids on isolated monasteries, but it had grown into an era of conquest, settlement, and cultural fusion. It reshaped not only political boundaries, but also language, law, and daily life. Britain had entered a new chapter, one where its identity was tested and remade by the warriors and settlers who came across the sea. Alfred the Great resists. By the late 9th century, the presence of Viking settlers and armies had altered the political map of Britain. The Danelaw stretched across much of the east and north, encompassing Northumbria, East Anglia, and a large portion of Mercia. Anglo-Saxon rulers were pressured, some paying tribute to avoid destruction, others falling entirely under Viking control. Amid this upheaval, one kingdom remained unconquered: Wessex in the south. Its survival would shape the course of English history, thanks above all to one figure, Alfred, later remembered as the Great. Alfred was born in 849 CE at Wantage in Berkshire, the youngest son of King Ethelwulf of Wessex. As a child, he visited Rome, where he was received by the Pope, a sign of Wessex's growing Christian ties. He was educated in both martial and spiritual traditions, though, like many of his age, he struggled at first with reading and writing. His early years were marked by the growing Viking threat, as successive invasions strained the kingdoms of England. When the great heathen army swept across the land in the 862nd, Wessex came under severe pressure. Alfred fought alongside his elder brother, King Ethelred, in a series of desperate battles. At Ashdown in 871, they won a significant victory, Alfred himself leading one wing of the army against the Vikings, yet victories were rare and defeats frequent. Ethelred died the same year, leaving Alfred to inherit the throne at a moment of grave crisis. As king, Alfred faced repeated invasions. Viking armies advanced into Wessex, seizing strongholds and wintering deep in his territory. In 878, Alfred was forced into retreat after a sudden assault by Guthrum, a powerful Viking leader. For a time, he hid in the marshes of Athelney in Somerset, reduced to a fugitive with only a small band of followers. This moment became legendary, later embroidered with stories such as the tale of Alfred burning the cakes he was meant to watch while in hiding. Yet Alfred's retreat was not defeat. From Athelney, he rallied support, sending messages to loyal nobles, raising forces from the shires, and preparing a counterattack. In the spring of 878, he gathered an army and confronted Guthrum at the Battle of Edington. The clash was fierce, but Alfred's forces prevailed, driving the Vikings back to their stronghold. Surrounded, Guthrum was forced to submit. He accepted baptism, with Alfred as his godfather, and agreed to withdraw from Wessex. The treaty that followed established boundaries between Wessex and the Danelaw, securing Alfred's kingdom and allowing him to consolidate power. Alfred's victory at Edington marked a turning point. It preserved Wessex as the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom and provided a foundation for future reconquest. But Alfred's greatness lay not only in military defence, but also in the reforms he introduced afterward. Recognizing that Viking raids could not be prevented by ad hoc responses, he reorganized Wessex's defences. He created a network of fortified towns, known as burhs, placed at strategic points across his kingdom. Each was designed to be within a day's march of the next, ensuring that no community was left vulnerable. These burhs, often built on earlier Roman or Iron Age sites, were surrounded by ditches and banks, manned by local garrisons. They became centres of both defence and commerce, where markets flourished under protection. Alfred also reorganised military service, requiring a system of rotation so that some men defended while others farmed, ensuring readiness without starving the land of labour. Equally important was Alfred's attention to naval defence. He recognised the Vikings' mastery of the sea and sought to counter it by building ships larger and sturdier than traditional longships. Though his fleet was modest, it marked the beginnings of an English navy, a recognition that the island's fate depended on controlling its shores. Beyond defence, Alfred fostered learning and law. He believed that ignorance and moral weakness had contributed to earlier defeats. To remedy this, he invited scholars from across Britain and the continent to his court, establishing a circle of learning at Winchester. He sponsored translations of key texts from Latin into Old English, including works of theology, philosophy, and history, making them accessible to his nobles and clergy. He himself took part in translation, emphasizing the importance of wisdom for good governance. Alfred also codified laws, blending earlier Anglo-Saxon customs with Christian principles. His law code sought to establish justice, protect the weak, and ensure order. In doing so, he reinforced both the authority of the crown and the moral foundation of his rule. These efforts gave Wessex not only military resilience, but also cultural strength. Rooting its survival in a sense of identity and continuity, the treaty with Guthrum did not end Viking activity. Raids and campaigns continued, with new armies arriving from overseas. But Alfred's system of burhs and reformed military service allowed Wessex to withstand them. The chronicle records repeated clashes. Some won, others lost, but Wessex endured where other kingdoms had fallen. By the time of Alfred's death in 899, Wessex stood as the dominant Anglo-Saxon kingdom, its resilience the bedrock of what would later become a unified England. Alfred's reign also left a deeper legacy. His emphasis on education preserved literacy and learning in a time when much of Europe struggled with decline. His legal reforms influenced the development of English law. His burh system shaped the geography of towns for centuries, with many modern English towns tracing their origins to Alfred's defences. His recognition of the sea's importance foreshadowed England's later naval tradition. For these reasons, Alfred alone among English kings earned the title the Great. He was not undefeated, Nor did he expel the Vikings entirely, but he ensured the survival of Anglo-Saxon rule, laying the groundwork for reconquest and eventual unification. Without Alfred, Wessex might have fallen, and the history of England would have taken a very different course. By the dawn of the 10th century, the struggle between Anglo-Saxons and Vikings was far from over. The Danelaw persisted. Viking rulers held sway in York and East Anglia, and new invasions would follow. Yet the resilience of Wessex under Alfred provided hope and direction. The stage was set for his successors to continue the fight, reclaiming lands and forging a kingdom that could endure. Norman conquest unfolds. The death of Alfred in 899 did not end the struggle with the Vikings. His son, Edward the Elder, and his daughter, Ethelflad, Lady of the Mercians, continued his work, expanding Wessex's influence and reclaiming territory from the Danelaw. Through campaigns and diplomacy, they brought more of England under Anglo-Saxon rule. By the mid-10th century, under King Aethelstan, Alfred's grandson, England was united for the first time as a single kingdom. Aethelstan defeated the combined forces of Scots, Vikings, and Britons at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, a victory celebrated in poetry as securing England's destiny. Yet unity was fragile. Viking raids continued, and Danish kings at times threatened or even seized the English throne. In the early 11th century, Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark invaded, and his son Canute established himself as King of England, ruling from 1016 to 1035. Under Canute, England was part of a North Sea empire that stretched across Denmark and Norway. His reign brought stability, but after his death, the kingdom slipped back into turmoil. By the middle of the 11th century, England was again under Anglo-Saxon rule, this time under Edward the Confessor. Edward, raised in Normandy during his exile, brought Norman influences into his court. Norman nobles gained positions in England. Norman churchmen held bishoprics, and ties across the Channel deepened. Yet Edward's reign left a problem unresolved. He died in January 1066 without a clear heir. The succession was contested, and the throne of England became the prize of rival claimants. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England, was chosen by the nobles and crowned king, but his claim was immediately challenged. Across the sea in Normandy, Duke William asserted that Edward had promised him the throne, and that Harold had sworn an oath to support him. To the north, Harald Hardrada of Norway, a veteran warrior and king, also claimed England, citing agreements with earlier rulers. The result was a year of extraordinary conflict, when England faced invasion from both north and south. In September 1066, Harald Hardrada landed in Yorkshire with a great force. Harold Godwinson marched north to meet him, covering the distance with remarkable speed. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the English army clashed with the Norwegians in fierce combat. The chronicle records that Hardrada fell in the fighting, along with most of his army. It was a stunning victory for Harold, but it came at a cost. His men were weary, his forces depleted, and even as he celebrated, news arrived that Duke William of Normandy had landed on the southern coast. Harold marched his army south, covering the distance in a matter of days. On the 14th of October, 1066, the two forces met near Hastings. William's army was a mix of Normans, Bretons, and other continental soldiers, equipped with cavalry and archers. Harold's army was largely infantry, shield-bearers forming a solid wall at the crest of a hill. The battle lasted most of the day, with Norman attacks repulsed again and again by the English shield wall. At one point, the Normans feigned retreat, drawing some of Harold's men down from their position, where they were cut down by cavalry. As the day wore on, the English line held but thinned. In the chaos, Harold himself was killed. Later tradition says by an arrow to the eye, though accounts differ. With his death, English resistance collapsed. William's army secured the field, and within weeks he advanced on London. On Christmas Day 1066, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The Norman conquest had begun. It was not a mere change of rulers, but a transformation of English society. William rewarded his followers with vast estates, dispossessing many Anglo-Saxon nobles. Castles rose across the landstone and timber fortresses from which Norman lords enforced their rule. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, recorded in detail the landholdings, resources, and people of England, a testament to Norman administrative control. The church, too, was reshaped. Norman bishops replaced many Anglo-Saxon leaders, and cathedrals in a new Romanesque style were built across the land. The language of the court and nobility shifted to Norman French, while Latin remained the language of the church and administration. Old English continued among the common people, but over time, the fusion of tongues would give birth to Middle English. Resistance to Norman rule flared in the years after 1066. Rebellions broke out in the north, where William's forces responded with brutal campaigns, including the Harrying of the North, which devastated wide areas and left famine in its wake. In the west and east, uprisings were crushed. Gradually, Norman authority extended, though often maintained by force. The impact of the conquest was immense. The old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was almost entirely replaced by a Norman elite. Feudal structures, already present in some form, were deepened and formalised. England became more closely tied to continental Europe, its rulers often holding lands in both England and France. The cultural landscape changed, from the design of castles and churches to the very words spoken in law and poetry. The Norman conquest thus marked the end of Anglo-Saxon England and the beginning of medieval England under Norman kings. It reshaped governance, society, language, and identity. From this moment forward, England's history would be bound not only to its island but also to the continent, caught between ties to Normandy and its own growing sense of nationhood. Castles and feudal order. With William of Normandy's victory at Hastings in 1066, England passed into a new phase of its history. The Norman conquest did not merely place a foreign duke on the English throne, it transformed the political and social order of the kingdom. In the decades that followed, William and his successors imposed a system of governance rooted in feudalism and reinforced by the physical presence of castles. The landscape of England was reshaped, its people reordered into new hierarchies of loyalty, obligation, and power. Feudalism, as established by the Normans, was a system of landholding tied directly to military service and loyalty to the king. All land was considered the property of William, who granted estates to his followers in return for their service. These estates, called fiefs, were distributed to Norman barons and knights, who in turn owed soldiers, supplies, and allegiance when called upon. Beneath them were the peasants who worked the land, bound by obligation and tradition to provide labour, produce, and rents. At the bottom stood the serfs, tied to the soil, unable to leave their lord's land without permission. This structure ensured that William's authority extended into every corner of the kingdom. No noble could hold land independently of the crown. All property flowed downward from the king. To cement his control, William ordered a comprehensive survey of his realm in 1086, the Domesday Book. This vast record listed landholdings, resources, livestock, and populations across England, providing not only a tool of governance, but also a symbol of royal power. It was said that no hide of land, no ox or plough, escaped its accounting. The Domesday Book stands today as one of the most remarkable documents of medieval Europe, offering a window into the world William created. Castles were the most visible manifestation of Norman rule. Though England had seen fortifications before, the Normans introduced the motte and bailey design on a massive scale. A motte was a raised earth mound topped by a wooden or later stone keep. The bailey was a walled courtyard below, containing barracks, stables, and workshops. Surrounded by ditches and palisades, these castles provided immediate security for their lords and garrisons. More importantly, they were instruments of domination. Castles were placed in strategic positions on hills, river crossings, and near towns not only to defend territory, but also to project power. From them, Norman lords enforced order, suppressed rebellion, and reminded the local population of the new regime. In time, Wooden fortifications gave way to stone. Towering keeps like the White Tower in London, built under William, became enduring symbols of Norman authority. The Tower of London, begun soon after the Conquest, loomed over the capital as both fortress and royal palace. Across the countryside, stone castles rose in York, Durham, Lincoln, and beyond, embedding the conquest into the very fabric of the land. Daily life under Norman rule reflected the feudal hierarchy. The barons, granted estates by William, lived in fortified halls or castles, surrounded by retainers and servants. They owed their wealth to the labour of peasants who tilled the fields, harvested grain, and tended livestock. In return, peasants were offered protection from bandits, raiders, and rival lords, yet their lives were bound by obligation, and freedom was limited. Serfs, in particular, were tied to the land, their labour owed as part of the estate. For the majority of the population, life was hard, centred on agriculture, with survival dependent on the harvest. Knights formed the backbone of military service. In return for land or payment, they provided armed service to their lords. Clad in chainmail, bearing shields marked with heraldic devices, and mounted on trained horses, knights became the warriors of the age. Tournaments and training sharpened their skills, but their loyalty was always tied through layers of obligation to the crown. The knightly class also developed codes of conduct, influenced by both martial tradition and Christian ideals. Though these codes were often more aspiration than reality, the church played a central role in Norman England. William had claimed that his invasion was sanctioned by the Pope, and he rewarded the church generously. Norman bishops and abbots replaced many of the Anglo-Saxon clergy, bringing the English church more firmly under continental influence. Great cathedrals were built in the Romanesque style, with massive stone walls, rounded arches, and soaring towers. Durham, Ely, and Winchester became centres of faith and power. Monasticism flourished, with abbeys like Cluny in France inspiring new foundations in England. The church not only provided spiritual guidance, but also acted as a partner in governance, its hierarchy reinforcing the feudal system. For the Anglo-Saxon nobility, the conquest was devastating. Most were dispossessed of their lands, replaced by Norman barons loyal to William. Some fled abroad, others resisted and were crushed. Rebellions flared in the north and west, but William responded with ruthless campaigns. The harrying of the north in 1069-70 saw villages burned, crops destroyed, and thousands left to starve. This brutal suppression ensured Norman control, but left scars that endured for generations. Economically, Norman rule tied England more closely to continental Europe. Trade expanded across the Channel, bringing goods, fashions, and ideas. The introduction of coinage reforms and tighter control of markets strengthened royal authority. Towns grew under Norman patronage, some fortified with walls, others prospering from trade fairs. Culturally, the Normans introduced new influences. The French language became the tongue of the court, law, and aristocracy, while Latin remained the language of the church and administration. Old English persisted among the common people, but over centuries, the blending of languages created the roots of Middle English. Literature, art, and architecture reflected continental styles, while local traditions adapted to new forms. The feudal order established by the Normans was both rigid and adaptable. It bound men to their lords and lords to their king, creating a pyramid of loyalty and service. Yet within this system, there was room for negotiation, for shifting alliances, and for the exercise of personal power. Kings needed their barons, barons relied on their knights, and all depended on the labour of peasants. It was a world of hierarchy, but also of interdependence. By the end of the 11th century, England had been remade. Castles stood across its landscape, feudal obligations bound its people, and Norman lords governed its estates. The old Anglo-Saxon order had been swept aside, replaced by a system that tied England more firmly into the fabric of medieval Europe. The conquest, brutal and transformative, had reshaped not only the structures of power, but the very identity of the kingdom. Church power expands. As Norman rule settled over England, One of the most enduring transformations came through the church. William the Conqueror had crossed the Channel with papal blessing, carrying a banner from Rome that framed his conquest as divinely sanctioned. In return, he reshaped the English church to reflect both his authority and the broader influence of continental Christendom. The result was an institution more powerful, more centralized, and more closely tied to the monarchy than it had ever been before. The Anglo-Saxon Church, before 1066, had been well established, with monasteries, cathedrals, and bishops playing important roles in society, but it retained distinctive features, such as married priests and local variations in practice. William and his advisors, many of them churchmen from Normandy, sought to align the English church more closely with Roman standards. This meant reform, reorganization, and the replacement of much of the Anglo-Saxon leadership with Norman clergy. One of William's earliest acts was to depose English bishops who had supported Harold Godwinson or who resisted reform. In their place, he appointed men loyal to him and to Rome, such as Lanfranc, a respected scholar and monk from Normandy. As Archbishop of Canterbury, Lanfranc reorganized the English church along continental lines. He strengthened the authority of Canterbury over York, reformed monasteries, enforced clerical celibacy more rigorously, and tightened links with Rome. Under his guidance, the church became both more disciplined and more hierarchical. Architecture became the most visible expression of this new power. The Normans undertook an extraordinary program of building, replacing Anglo-Saxon churches with massive Romanesque cathedrals. These structures, with their rounded arches, thick walls, vaulted ceilings, and soaring towers, symbolized both the majesty of God and the authority of the Norman order. Durham Cathedral, begun in 1093, stands as one of the greatest examples of this style. Its scale and design awe-inspiring even today. Across the land, cathedrals at Winchester, Ely, Gloucester, and elsewhere rose, transforming the skyline and embedding Norman presence into stone. Monasticism flourished under Norman patronage. Monks and nuns followed the Benedictine rule, emphasizing prayer, study, and labour. New monasteries were founded, while older ones were reformed. The abbeys of Cluny in France inspired English counterparts, which in turn became centres of both devotion and economic activity. Monasteries held vast lands, managed agriculture, copied manuscripts, and offered charity. They were not only spiritual havens, but also hubs of learning and wealth. Pilgrims travelled to holy sites, seeking healing and indulgence, reinforcing the church's role in daily life. The church also became deeply entwined with governance. Bishops and abbots sat in the king's councils, advising on matters of law and policy. They administered lands, collected tithes, and mediated disputes. In many ways, the church was an extension of royal authority, yet it also claimed spiritual independence, insisting on its right to guide souls and enforce divine law. This dual role created tensions that would flare into open conflict in the following century. William himself was careful to balance these dynamics. He asserted royal authority over the church, declaring that no papal letters could be published in England without his consent, and that bishops owed loyalty to him as king. At the same time, he cultivated good relations with Rome, ensuring that his conquest remained recognized as legitimate. Under his reign, the alliance of crown and church was firm, each supporting the other's authority. But after William's death, these tensions grew. His successors, William Rufus, Henry I, and Stephen, faced disputes with church leaders, particularly over the right to appoint bishops. This struggle, part of a wider European conflict known as the Investiture Controversy, questioned whether kings or popes held the ultimate authority to appoint high church officials. In England, compromises were reached, but the question revealed the growing power of the church as an institution capable of challenging kings. Beyond politics, the influence of the church reached deep into the lives of ordinary people. Parish churches spread across villages, bringing regular worship into local communities. Priests administered sacraments, baptism, marriage, burial that marked the milestones of life. Holy days structured the calendar, with festivals and fasts shaping the rhythm of the year. Bells summoned villagers to worship, processions wound through fields to bless crops, and sermons reminded people of salvation and sin. The church was not a distant authority, but a constant presence, shaping belief, practice, and community identity. Education also advanced through the church. Monastic schools taught Latin, scripture, and basic literacy to boys destined for clerical service. Some cathedral schools developed into centres of higher learning, training scholars who contributed to the growth of medieval thought. Manuscript production flourished, preserving not only religious texts, but also classical works of philosophy, medicine, and science. The illuminated pages of psalters and gospels testify to both devotion and artistry. The church's wealth grew steadily, fueled by landholdings, tithes, and donations. Lords and kings endowed monasteries with estates, seeking spiritual favour and the prayers of monks for their souls. Pilgrimage sites attracted offerings, and relics were venerated as conduits of divine power. This wealth allowed the church to build on an extraordinary scale, but it also drew criticism. Voices within and outside the church warned against corruption, luxury, and deviation from spiritual ideals. By the 12th century, the church in England stood as one of the most powerful institutions in society. It guided faith, governed lands, influenced kings, and connected England to the broader Christian world. Its cathedrals and monasteries dominated landscapes. Its rituals shaped the lives of peasants and nobles alike. The expansion of church power under the Normans was not simply a matter of religious devotion, but a cornerstone of the medieval order. Yet with this power came conflict. Future kings would clash with archbishops, popes would demand greater authority, and reform movements would challenge wealth and privilege. For now, though, in the century after 1066, the church stood in alliance with Norman kings, its towers rising above the fields and towns of England, proclaiming both divine majesty and earthly order. Magna Carta sealed. The 12th and early 13th centuries were times of both consolidation and tension in England. The Norman conquest had established a powerful monarchy supported by feudal structures and the church. But over time, the balance between royal authority and the rights of nobles, clergy, and townspeople grew increasingly strained. Kings sought to expand their power, their revenues, and their territories, while their subjects demanded protection from arbitrary rule. This mounting conflict came to a head in 1215 with the sealing of the Magna Carta, one of the most famous documents in English history. The roots of Magna Carta stretch back to the reign of the Angevin kings. Henry II, ruling from 1154 to 1189, had sought to strengthen royal justice, reorganize courts, and impose authority across his vast empire, which included not only England, but also large parts of France. His reign saw significant legal reforms: the establishment of royal judges travelling on circuit, the use of juries, and the beginnings of English common law. Yet Henry's efforts to control the church led to bitter disputes, most famously with Archbishop Thomas Becket. Their conflict over the rights of clergy and the authority of royal courts culminated in Becket's murder in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170, an act that shocked Christendom and forced Henry to perform public penance. Henry's sons carried his legacy in different ways. Richard I, known as the Lionheart, spent most of his reign abroad, fighting in the Crusades and defending his lands in France. His absences drained the kingdom's resources, as taxes were raised to fund armies and ransoms. Richard's younger brother, John, inherited the crown in 1199. His reign proved disastrous for royal authority, provoking discontent among nearly every sector of society. John's troubles began with foreign policy. He lost Normandy and other French territories after conflicts with King Philip II of France. These defeats not only weakened England's continental holdings, but also undermined John's prestige as a ruler. To recover his losses and defend his remaining lands, John levied heavy taxes on his barons and demanded military service. His financial exactions were relentless, extending to feudal dues, scutage payments, money paid in place of military service, and fines. The burden strained relations with the nobility, who felt exploited and alienated. At the same time, John quarrelled with the church. In 1205, a dispute arose over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury. When John refused the candidate chosen by Pope Innocent III, the Pope placed England under interdict in 1208, suspending church services across the realm. In 1209, John himself was excommunicated. For several years, the king ruled in isolation from the church, seizing ecclesiastical lands and revenues. Eventually, in 1213, John submitted, accepting England as a papal fief and paying tribute to Rome. This restored relations with the papacy, but further damaged John's reputation at home. Discontent grew into open rebellion. The barons, resentful of John's arbitrary rule, his financial demands, and his military failures, began to organise against him. They found allies among the church, and even among towns that suffered from royal exactions. By 1215, many barons had taken up arms, seizing London and forcing John to negotiate. The result was the Magna Carta, sealed at Runnymede, on the banks of the Thames, in June 1215. The document was not a single revolutionary charter, but a collection of promises and concessions addressing the grievances of John's subjects. Its clauses covered a wide range of issues: the rights of the church, the limits of royal taxation, the treatment of barons and knights, the administration of justice, and the protection of towns and merchants. Among its most famous provisions was the principle that the king could not levy taxes without the consent of his council of barons, a seed of what would later grow into parliamentary government. Another crucial clause stated that no free man could be imprisoned, dispossessed, or outlawed except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. This principle, though limited in scope at the time, laid the foundation for the idea of due process and the rule of law. Magna Carta also established that the king himself was subject to the law, a striking assertion in an age of monarchical power. For contemporaries, Magna Carta was less about lofty ideals than about practical constraints. The barons sought to protect their own rights and properties, the church its privileges, and merchants their trade. Yet the broader significance of the document endured, as its principles were reinterpreted and expanded in later centuries. John himself had no intention of keeping his promises. Almost immediately after sealing Magna Carta, he sought papal annulment, declaring the charter void. Civil war broke out between the king and his barons, known as the First Barons' War. The rebels even invited Prince Louis of France to take the English throne, but in 1216, John died suddenly, leaving his 9-year-old son, Henry III, as king. The regents governing on Henry's behalf reissued Magna Carta to secure baronial support, beginning the process by which the charter became a lasting symbol rather than a failed peace treaty. Over time, Magna Carta was confirmed and reissued by successive monarchs. Its specific clauses were often revised, but its core principles endured. It became a touchstone for the limits of royal power, cited by rebels, reformers, and lawyers in centuries to come. In the 13th century, it helped shape the emergence of Parliament, as kings sought broader consent for taxation. In later centuries, it was invoked in struggles between Crown and Parliament, and even across the Atlantic by American colonists demanding their rights. In its own age, Magna Carta reflected the tensions of a kingdom where the monarchy had grown too heavy-handed, and where nobles and churchmen sought to protect their privileges. But its enduring legacy lies in the broader idea that power must be limited, that rulers are subject to law, and that subjects have rights that cannot be arbitrarily taken away. The events of 1215 did not resolve England's struggles, but they marked a turning point. The monarchy remained strong, yet it could no longer claim absolute authority unchecked. From this moment, the balance of power in England began to shift, slowly, unevenly, but decisively, toward a system where the voice of subjects, however limited, played a role in governance. 100 Years' War begins. By the early 14th century, England had grown into a kingdom deeply influenced by the legacies of the Norman Conquest, the feudal order, and the precedent of Magna Carta. Kings wielded immense power, but their authority was increasingly bound by councils of nobles and by law. England's rulers, however, still looked across the Channel to their continental possessions. The legacy of William the Conqueror and his successors meant that English kings held lands in France not as independent monarchs, but as vassals to the French crown. This dual identity sowed the seeds of one of the longest and most destructive conflicts in medieval history, the 100 Years' War. The origins of the war lay in a tangled web of dynastic claims, feudal obligations, and growing rivalries between England and France. The immediate spark came in 1328, when Charles IV of France died without a male heir. According to French law, succession through the female line was not permitted. The crown passed instead to Philip VI, a cousin of Charles. Yet Edward III of England, grandson of Philip IV of France through his mother Isabella, claimed the throne as the closest male descendant in line. The French rejected his claim, but Edward refused to accept their decision quietly. At the same time, tensions grew over Gascony, a region in southwest France held by the English crown. Though technically a fief of the French king, Gascony was vital to England's economy, supplying wine and serving as a link to continental trade. French kings sought to weaken English control, while English kings resisted interference. By the 1332nd, disputes over Gascony and Edward's claim to the French throne had brought the two kingdoms to war. In 1337, Edward formally declared himself King of France, setting in motion a conflict that would last, in intermittent phases, for more than a century. The 100 Years' War was not a single continuous struggle, but a series of campaigns, truces, and shifting alliances, punctuated by some of the most famous battles of the medieval world. England's early campaigns were marked by striking victories, thanks to a combination of tactics, weaponry, and leadership. The English longbow, a powerful weapon requiring years of training to master, gave their armies a crucial advantage. At the Battle of Crecy in 1346, Edward III's forces, though outnumbered, defeated a much larger French army. Waves of French cavalry charged the English lines, but were cut down by volleys of arrows. The longbowman's discipline and devastating range shattered traditional knightly warfare, signalling a transformation in medieval combat. 10 years later, in 1356, the English won another major victory at the Battle of Poitiers. Here, Edward's son, the Black Prince, captured the French king, John II, and many nobles. The humiliation forced France to negotiate the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, granting England significant territories and a large ransom for the king's release. For a time, English fortunes in France seemed to be at their height. Yet the war was not only about battles. It was also about money, politics, and alliances. Funding campaigns required heavy taxation, which in England meant negotiation with Parliament. As a result, the war accelerated the growth of parliamentary power, as kings were forced to seek approval for extraordinary levies. In France too, the war strained resources, causing unrest and peasant revolts such as the Jacquerie in 1358. The conflict also unfolded in the shadow of wider crises. The Black Death swept across Europe in the late 1342nd, killing vast numbers in both England and France. Armies were thinned, villages deserted, and economies disrupted. Yet even in the face of such catastrophe, the war resumed, each side unwilling to yield its claims. By the later 14th century, fortunes shifted. Under Charles V of France and his capable generals, the French regained much of the territory lost earlier. English holdings shrank, though Calais remained a crucial outpost. The war dragged on into the 15th century, reignited under Henry V of England, whose campaign brought one of the most famous victories in medieval history, the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. At Agincourt, Henry's smaller army, weakened by disease and exhaustion, faced a much larger French force. The muddy field and the disciplined use of longbowmen again proved decisive. French knights, charging in heavy armour, became mired in the ground and fell under relentless arrow fire. The English slaughtered thousands, capturing high-ranking nobles and cementing Henry's reputation as a warrior king. The victory allowed Henry to negotiate the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which recognised him as heir to the French throne and regent of France. For a moment, It seemed possible that the crowns of England and France would be united, but Henry's death in 1422, leaving an infant son, and the revival of French resistance under leaders such as Joan of Arc, turned the tide once more. By the mid-15th century, English forces were driven out of all their French possessions except Calais. The 100 Years' War had profound consequences for both kingdoms. In England, it fostered a sense of national identity, as kings invoked England rather than just their feudal domains. It strengthened Parliament's role, as taxation for war required broader consent. It also left the nobility strained by decades of conflict, contributing to internal instability. In France, the war devastated much of the countryside, but also led to the strengthening of royal authority as the Valois kings rebuilt their kingdom. For ordinary people, the war meant disruption, taxation, and suffering. Villages were raided, lands destroyed, and families torn apart by military service and disease. Yet it also created opportunities, as soldiers rose through merit, and merchants profited from war supplies. The imagery of the longbowman became central to English pride, symbolizing the resilience of common soldiers against knightly elites. By its end in 1453, the 100 Years' War left England exhausted and divided, its dreams of continental empire dashed. Within a decade, the kingdom would turn inward, as rival dynasties plunged into civil war. The struggle with France had defined an era, but its conclusion marked the beginning of new conflicts on English soil. The Wars of the Roses. Black Death descends. The mid-14th century brought England not only the upheavals of war with France, but also one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. The Black Death, arriving in 1348, transformed society more deeply and more suddenly than almost any other event of the medieval era. In a matter of months, it swept through towns and villages, killing rich and poor alike, emptying fields, closing workshops, and shaking the foundations of church and kingdom. The disease had its origins far beyond England, spreading westward from Central Asia along trade routes through the Middle East and across the Mediterranean. In 1347, it reached European ports, carried by ships whose rats and fleas transmitted the deadly bacterium. By the following year, it crossed the Channel into southern England. Contemporary accounts describe the suddenness of its arrival. Ships docking in Dorset with crews already dying, villages where entire families perished within days, and the rapid spread inland along roads and rivers. Symptoms were terrifying. Victims suffered fever, chills, and weakness, followed by the appearance of painful swellings, buboes in the groin, armpits, or neck. Death often came within days. Others contracted pneumonic plague, spread directly from person to person, which killed even more swiftly. Medieval medicine had no defense. Physicians prescribed herbs, charms, and bloodletting, but nothing worked. Priests urged prayer and penance, while some communities turned to processions and flagellation. None of it stopped the spread. Mortality was staggering. Modern estimates suggest that between 1/3 and 1/2 of England's population died in the first wave, which lasted until 1350. In towns, the dead were so numerous that churchyards overflowed. Mass graves were dug, and bodies laid side by side without ceremony. In London, excavations have uncovered plague pits where hundreds were interred together. In villages, entire communities disappeared, their houses left empty, fields untended, and churches abandoned. The fabric of daily life seemed to collapse. The psychological impact was immense. Chroniclers described terror, despair, and the breakdown of normal order. Priests died in such numbers that parishes were left without clergy. Courts and markets ceased to function. Families sometimes abandoned the sick for fear of infection. Others turned to superstition, blaming the stars, bad air, or even scapegoats such as outsiders or minorities. The sense of an indiscriminate catastrophe, striking lords and peasants alike, left deep scars in memory and culture. Yet the plague's consequences were not only destructive, they also reshaped society in enduring ways. The sudden loss of population created acute labour shortages. Fields went unploughed, harvests were delayed, and lords struggled to find peasants to work their estates. Surviving labourers could demand higher wages or better terms. Some moved from manor to manor, seeking improved conditions. Others left agriculture altogether, drifting towards towns where new opportunities beckoned. The government attempted to control these changes. In 1351, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and compel workers to remain on their estates. In practice, enforcement was uneven, and workers often resisted. Over the following decades, tensions between landowners seeking to maintain feudal obligations and labourers pressing for greater freedom grew sharper. The social contract of medieval England was being rewritten, driven by demographic catastrophe. Land use also shifted. With fewer hands to farm, marginal lands were abandoned, forests and commons reclaimed by nature. Some lords converted arable land to pasture, raising sheep for the expanding wool trade, which required fewer labourers. Villages shrank, and in some cases disappeared, leaving behind only ruins and traces in the landscape. The church faced challenges as well. With clergy dying in vast numbers, replacements were often hastily trained and poorly prepared. The quality of pastoral care declined in many parishes, leading to criticism of clerical standards. At the same time, the church's inability to explain or halt the plague undermined its authority. Popular piety did not vanish, but it changed, turning toward more personal forms of devotion and lay movements that questioned established structures. Art and literature reflected the trauma. Themes of death and judgment became prominent, with images of skeletons, graves, and the dance of death, reminding viewers of mortality's certainty. Writers lamented the devastation, while others sought to find meaning in divine punishment or human sin. The Black Death became a cultural touchstone, shaping memory for generations. The plague did not disappear after 1350. Recurrences struck England in the following decades, less severe than the first wave, but deadly nonetheless. These repeated outbreaks kept population growth suppressed, reinforcing the economic and social transformations already underway. By 1400, England's population was still far below its level in 1300, ensuring that labour remained valuable and the old feudal bonds weakened. For the monarchy and nobility, the consequences were profound. With fewer peasants bound to the land, lords saw their incomes decline. Some adapted by leasing land to tenant farmers or by investing in sheep and wool. Others struggled and fell into decline. The crown, too, felt the effects, as tax revenues shrank and the costs of war with France mounted. The political strains of the 14th century rebellions, disputes over succession, and unrest were intensified by the demographic shock of the plague. Among the most significant long-term effects was the empowerment of the lower classes. Though still bound within a hierarchical society, peasants gained leverage through labour shortages. Their demands for freedom and fair treatment erupted in later decades, most dramatically in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. That uprising drew its roots, in part from the frustrations created by the Black Death proof that the pandemic had not only thinned the population, but also destabilised the social order. By reshaping labour, land, wealth, and faith, the Black Death marked a watershed in English history. It exposed the fragility of medieval systems and accelerated change already underway. Though devastating in human cost, it opened the way to transformations that would alter the balance of power between lord and peasant, crown and parliament, church and laity. When the plague first struck in 1348, few could imagine its consequences. Entire families vanished, villages fell silent, and grief darkened every community. Yet from the devastation arose a new social landscape, one in which old certainties no longer held and new possibilities emerged. England, like the rest of Europe, would never be the same. Wars of the Roses rage. The 15th century in England was marked by turmoil, instability, and dynastic conflict. The long struggle with France, the 100 Years' War, had drained the kingdom's resources, and its disappointing conclusion in 1453 left England with little to show but the port of Calais. At the same time, political divisions among the nobility deepened, and questions of royal legitimacy festered. Out of this volatile mixture emerged a civil conflict that tore England apart for decades, the Wars of the Roses. The name itself comes from later tradition. The rival houses were the Lancastrians, symbolised by a red rose, and the Yorkists, symbolised by a white one, both descended from the royal line of Edward III. But their claims to the throne set them against one another in a struggle for supremacy. Beneath this dynastic rivalry lay deeper problems: weakened monarchy, economic hardship, and a powerful nobility accustomed to private armies and personal ambition. The roots of the conflict began with the reign of Henry VI, a Lancastrian king who ascended the throne in 1422 as an infant. His long minority left governance in the hands of regents and magnates, and his adult reign was plagued by weakness. Unlike his father, Henry V, the victor of Agincourt, Henry VI lacked military skill and political authority. He was pious and gentle, more suited to monastic life than kingship. As France regained its strength and drove the English out of its territories, Henry appeared ineffectual. Discontent spread among nobles and commons alike. To make matters worse, Henry suffered bouts of mental illness, at times incapable of ruling. During these episodes, rival nobles vied for control of the kingdom. Chief among them was Richard, Duke of York, who had a strong claim to the throne and resented the dominance of Henry's queen, Margaret of Anjou, and her faction at court. The rivalry escalated into open conflict in 1455, when the first battle was fought at St. Albans. This clash marked the beginning of intermittent civil war that would last for more than 30 years. The Wars of the Roses were not continuous fighting, but a series of campaigns, battles, and shifting allegiances. Nobles switched sides as fortunes changed, and the crown itself passed back and forth between houses. In 1461, after the bloody Battle of Towton, one of the largest and deadliest battles fought on English soil, Edward, Duke of York, defeated the Lancastrians and became Edward IV. His reign brought a measure of stability, but tensions persisted. Edward's rule was challenged by internal discord, particularly with the powerful Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker. Initially a supporter, Warwick turned against Edward when his influence waned. In 1470, Warwick restored Henry VI to the throne, but the reversal was short-lived. Edward returned the following year, defeating his enemies at the Battle of Barnet, and again at Tewkesbury, where the Lancastrian heir was killed. Henry VI was captured and later died in the Tower of London, leaving Edward IV secure as king. For a time, it seemed the Yorkist cause had triumphed. Edward ruled until his death in 1483, but his passing reopened the struggle. His young son, Edward V, was placed under the protection of his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Within months, Richard declared the boy and his brother illegitimate, seizing the throne as Richard III. The fate of the princes confined in the Tower and never seen again remains one of history's enduring mysteries. Their disappearance tarnished Richard's reputation and undermined his legitimacy. Opposition soon gathered. Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian with a tenuous claim to the throne, raised an army and landed in Wales. In 1485, his forces met Richard's at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Richard fought bravely, but he was killed in the fighting, the last English king to die on the battlefield. Henry was crowned as Henry VII, founding the Tudor dynasty. His marriage to Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, symbolically united the warring houses, ending decades of dynastic conflict. The Wars of the Roses left deep scars. Noble families were decimated, estates ruined, and loyalties shattered. The conflict exposed the dangers of a monarchy too weak to control ambitious magnates and too unstable to secure orderly succession. Yet its conclusion brought a new era. The Tudors, beginning with Henry VII, imposed stronger royal authority, curbed the power of the nobility, and laid the foundations for a centralized state. For ordinary people, the wars were a time of uncertainty. Armies moved across the countryside, seizing supplies, conscripting men, and leaving devastation in their wake. Villages near battlefields bore the brunt of violence. Chroniclers recorded the bloodshed of battles like Towton, Barnet, and Tewkesbury, where thousands were slain. The repeated changes of king brought instability in governance, law, and taxation. Yet the resilience of local communities allowed daily life to continue in the midst of upheaval. Fields were still ploughed, markets held, and churches filled, even as nobles fought for crowns above them. The symbolism of the red and white roses came later, popularized in the Tudor era to emphasize reconciliation, but the reality was far more complex. A brutal contest of ambition, survival, and shifting alliances that defined a generation. Out of its chaos, however, emerged a dynasty that would preside over one of the most famous periods of English history, the Age of the Tudors. Tudor power consolidates. When Henry VII emerged victorious at Bosworth Field in 1485, he did more than win a crown. He ended decades of civil war and set England on a new path. The Wars of the Roses had torn noble families apart, drained resources, and undermined faith in the monarchy. Henry's achievement was not only to defeat Richard III, but also to establish a dynasty that would bring stability and central authority to England for more than a century. The Tudor period was about consolidation of power, of monarchy, of national identity. Henry VII's claim to the throne was not especially strong by blood. His Lancastrian descent came through a legitimised but originally illegitimate line, and his victory owed more to military fortune and discontent with Richard than to clear hereditary right. To secure his position, Henry married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV. This union symbolically joined the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York, creating the Tudor rose as a new emblem of unity. By blending the rival houses, Henry sought to close the chapter of dynastic strife and present his rule as one of reconciliation. From the outset, Henry VII focused on strengthening royal authority. He reduced the power of overmighty nobles who had dominated during the Wars of the Roses. Through careful marriages, grants, and confiscations, he ensured that the aristocracy remained dependent on the crown. He employed bonds and recognizances, financial penalties, for disloyalty that kept nobles in check. At the same time, he built a more efficient system of government, relying on loyal administrators and lawyers rather than powerful lords. His use of the Court of Star Chamber allowed him to enforce order and bypass noble influence. Financial prudence was central to Henry's reign. Aware of the cost of war and instability, he carefully managed revenues, collecting taxes efficiently and restoring the crown's wealth. He promoted trade, signing treaties that opened markets and encouraged English merchants. The expansion of the wool trade, especially, brought prosperity to towns and guilds. By the end of his reign, Henry left a secure treasury, a rarity for medieval monarchs. Henry's foreign policy was cautious but effective. He arranged strategic marriages to strengthen alliances, most famously marrying his eldest son, Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand, and Isabella of Spain. This union tied England to one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. When Arthur died young, Henry arranged for Catherine to marry his second son, Henry, ensuring the alliance endured. Diplomatically, Henry avoided costly continental wars, focusing instead on securing his dynasty and keeping England stable. Religion under Henry VII remained firmly Catholic. The Church provided legitimacy to his reign, and he supported its institutions. Monasteries and clergy remained powerful, though criticism of clerical wealth and corruption simmered beneath the surface. For the moment, however, England's religious unity was secure. Henry's greatest legacy was not in dramatic conquests or reforms, but in the stability he created. When he died in 1509, he left to his son a secure throne, a replenished treasury, and a monarchy far stronger than the one he had inherited. That son, Henry VIII, would transform England in ways his father could scarcely have imagined. Henry VIII ascended the throne at the age of 17, handsome, athletic, and ambitious. Unlike his cautious father, Henry sought glory, both in war and in display. He revived claims to French lands, launching campaigns that brought some victories but little lasting gain. His court was a place of splendour, filled with music, tournaments, and pageantry. Yet beneath the surface of magnificence lay challenges that would define his reign. Chief among these was his desire for a male heir. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon produced a daughter, Mary, but no surviving sons. As the years passed, Henry grew desperate for a male successor to secure the Tudor line. His request to annul his marriage was denied by Pope Clement VII, bound by political pressures in Europe. Henry's response was radical. He broke with Rome, declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England. The English Reformation began as a dynastic matter, but soon reshaped religion, politics, and society. Monasteries were dissolved, their lands seized by the crown, redistributing immense wealth and altering the landscape of England. Those who resisted Henry's authority, such as Sir Thomas More, were executed. The shift was not toward Protestantism, as later understood Henry remained conservative in doctrine, but it severed England from papal authority and laid the groundwork for further religious change. Henry's reign was also marked by the strengthening of royal power. By seizing monastic lands and wealth, he enriched the crown and secured the loyalty of nobles who received grants. The court became the centre of patronage, with Henry at its heart. Yet his rule was also characterised by volatility, wives married and discarded, ministers rising and falling, and enemies swiftly eliminated. By the time of Henry's death in 1547, the Tudor monarchy had grown more powerful than ever. The throne passed to his young son, Edward I, under whose reign Protestant reforms advanced, then to Mary I, who sought to restore Catholicism, and finally to Elizabeth I, who would preside over one of the most celebrated periods in English history. The consolidation of Tudor power was not complete in Henry VII's reign, nor even in Henry VIII. It was a process spanning decades, built on the foundations of dynastic union, financial stability, and the assertion of royal supremacy. The Tudors emerged from the chaos of the Wars of the Roses as a dynasty that redefined monarchy, religion, and nation. Their power, once fragile, became the framework within which England entered the modern age. Henry VIII's break with Rome. The reign of Henry VIII is remembered above all for the dramatic break with the Roman Catholic Church, a rupture that forever altered England's religious, political, and cultural landscape. Though the seeds of change had long been growing in Europe, criticisms of clerical wealth, calls for reform, and early stirrings of Protestant thought it was Henry's personal dynastic crisis that turned these currents into revolution. When Henry came to the throne in 1509, he was a devout Catholic. He attended Mass daily, defended traditional doctrine, and even wrote a treatise against Martin Luther in the 1522nd, earning from the Pope the title Defender of the Faith. For decades, there was no sign that Henry intended to sever ties with Rome. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, widow of his late brother Arthur, was sanctioned by papal dispensation and strengthened England's alliance with Spain. For many years, the union appeared stable, yet by the 1522nd, Henry grew increasingly anxious over the lack of a male heir. Catherine bore several children, but only one, Mary, survived infancy. Henry's fears of dynastic instability were sharpened by memories of the Wars of the Roses, when disputed claims had plunged the kingdom into chaos. Desperate for a son, Henry sought to annul his marriage, arguing that it was invalid because Catherine had been his brother's wife. He appealed to Scripture, claiming their union was cursed by God. Pope Clement VII, however, refused to grant the annulment. Political circumstances weighed heavily. Catherine's nephew was Charles V, the powerful Holy Roman Emperor, whose armies dominated Italy. To offend Charles by humiliating his aunt was unthinkable for the Pope. Frustrated, Henry turned to his own advisors, seeking a way to free himself from papal authority. Chief among these was Thomas Cromwell, a shrewd lawyer and statesman who argued that the English crown should exercise supremacy over the church within its own realm. With support from Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, Henry pushed through a series of laws in the 1532nd that severed ties with Rome. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 declared the king supreme head of the Church of England. Papal authority was abolished. Appeals to Rome were forbidden. Bishops and clergy were now subject to the crown. This was not merely a matter of legal reform. It unleashed sweeping change. Monasteries, long powerful centres of wealth, learning, and spirituality, were dissolved. Their lands were seized, their treasures confiscated, and their communities dispersed. Some monks and nuns found pensions. Others were cast adrift. The crown enriched itself enormously, granting monastic lands to nobles and gentry, thereby binding them to the new order. The dissolution transformed the economic and social landscape, redistributing resources and reshaping patterns of land ownership. Religious life also shifted. While Henry remained doctrinally conservative, upholding belief in the Mass, the sacraments, and clerical celibacy, his break with Rome opened the door to further reform. The Bible was translated into English, making Scripture accessible to lay people for the first time on a large scale. Sermons and printed tracts spread new ideas, yet Henry's government strictly controlled what was acceptable, punishing both those who resisted the break with Rome and those who pushed Protestantism too far. Heresy trials and executions took place on both sides. The changes provoked resistance. In 1536, the Pilgrimage of Grace erupted in the north, a massive popular uprising against the dissolution of monasteries and the intrusion of royal authority into religion. Tens of thousands joined the movement, demanding the restoration of traditional practices. Though initially conciliatory, Henry ultimately suppressed the revolt with brutal force. Leaders were executed, and royal power reaffirmed. The rebellion revealed the depth of attachment many still felt to the old church. Even as the king pressed ahead with reform, Henry's marital affairs further shaped the course of events. His annulment from Catherine of Aragon was followed by marriage to Anne Boleyn, who gave birth to Elizabeth but failed to produce a male heir. Accused of adultery and treason, Anne was executed in 1536. Henry married Jane Seymour next, who bore him a long-awaited son, Edward, before dying shortly after childbirth. Subsequent marriages to Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr brought further intrigue and scandal, but none altered the central reality. Henry's quest for succession had redrawn England's religious map. By the time of Henry's death in 1547, the Church of England stood firmly under royal control. Though it retained much of Catholic doctrine in practice, it was no longer subject to Rome. The monasteries were gone, their lands enriching the crown and nobility. Royal supremacy was established as a principle of governance, binding religion to monarchy in unprecedented ways. The break with Rome was not simply about Henry's marriages or personal will. It reshaped the kingdom's institutions, economy, and identity. It created a national church, tied to the crown, distinct from continental Catholicism. It set England on a path toward Protestant Reformation, though the direction would fluctuate under Henry's successors. Edward VI would push reforms further toward Protestantism. Mary I would attempt to restore Catholic unity, and Elizabeth VI would establish a lasting compromise. In retrospect, Henry VIII's break with Rome was one of the defining moments of English history. It ended centuries of papal authority, redistributed wealth on a massive scale, and altered the balance of power between king, nobility, and clergy. It also contributed to England's emerging sense of independence, setting the stage for conflicts and achievements in the centuries to come. The Tudor consolidation begun by Henry VII was thus completed in a very different fashion by his son, not through caution and reconciliation, but through bold, disruptive action. Henry VIII left behind a kingdom richer, stronger, and more centralized, but also divided, uncertain, and forever changed in its relationship with faith and authority. Elizabethan Golden Age. The mid-16th century was a time of religious turmoil and dynastic uncertainty. Henry VIII's break with Rome had created a national church, but his successors deepened the divisions. Edward VI pushed Protestant reforms further, introducing English liturgy and reducing traditional ritual. Mary I, in contrast, sought to restore Catholicism, marrying Philip II of Spain and burning Protestant dissenters in her effort to return England to Rome. Her reign, though brief, left the kingdom scarred by persecution and instability. When Mary died in 1558 without an heir, the throne passed to her half-sister Elizabeth, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth inherited a realm weary of religious strife and uncertain of its place in the world. Her long reign, lasting until 1603, would bring relative stability, cultural flourishing, and a new sense of national identity. Later generations remembered it as a golden age, though it was also an era of challenge and conflict. Elizabeth's first priority was religion. She sought a settlement that would unite her people without provoking constant upheaval. The Elizabethan religious settlement of 1559 re-established the Church of England's independence from Rome, while allowing for a balance between Protestant doctrine and some traditional practices. The Act of Supremacy declared Elizabeth supreme governor of the Church, while the Act of Uniformity required the use of the Book of Common Prayer. The compromise was not accepted by all Catholics, remained loyal to Rome, and Puritans sought further reform, but it provided a framework that endured. Politically, Elizabeth ruled with a careful blend of authority and consultation. She relied on trusted ministers, most notably William Cecil, later Lord Burghley, who guided policy for decades. The Queen skillfully balanced factions at court, preventing any single noble from dominating. Her unmarried status became a tool of diplomacy, as foreign princes sought her hand, and she used the possibility of marriage to negotiate alliances. Though she was often urged to marry and produce an heir, Elizabeth never did, cultivating instead the image of the Virgin Queen, wedded to her kingdom. Externally, Elizabeth faced threats from powerful Catholic monarchs. The most persistent was Philip II of Spain, whose empire stretched across Europe and the Americas. Religious conflict sharpened relations, especially after Elizabeth supported Protestant rebels in the Netherlands and allowed English privateers to attack Spanish treasure fleets. Tensions culminated in 1588 with the Spanish Armada, a vast fleet launched to invade England. The Armada's defeat became one of the defining moments of Elizabeth's reign. English ships, smaller and more maneuverable, harassed the Spanish fleet in the Channel. Storms scattered the Armada as it attempted to retreat around Scotland and Ireland, leaving thousands of sailors dead. The victory was celebrated as divine favour, reinforcing Elizabeth's authority and boosting national pride. England's survival against Europe's most powerful monarch was seen as proof of its resilience and independence. At home, Elizabeth's reign saw cultural and economic vitality. The growth of trade expanded England's reach. The Muscovy Company and the East India Company opened routes to Russia and Asia, while merchants pushed into Africa and the Americas. Privateers such as Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe, challenging Spanish dominance overseas. Though England was not yet a global empire, the seeds of future expansion were planted. Culturally, the Elizabethan era produced a flowering of literature, music, and drama. The works of William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, and others transformed English literature, exploring themes of power, love, fate, and nationhood in ways that resonated for centuries. The theatres of London thrived, drawing audiences from all walks of life. Poetry and music flourished at court, where Elizabeth herself was a skilled patron and participant. This cultural vibrancy contributed to the enduring image of the period as a golden age, yet beneath the brilliance lay tensions. Religious divisions persisted, with Catholic plots threatening Elizabeth's life and Puritans pressing for deeper reform. Economic inequality grew, and periods of poor harvests brought hardship to the poor. The enforcement of religious conformity was harsh, with recusants fined and dissenters punished. Elizabeth's government relied heavily on surveillance, spies, and harsh penalties for treason. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587 revealed both the danger Elizabeth faced from rival claimants and the ruthlessness with which she defended her throne. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, England was stronger and more confident than it had been in decades. Its independence from Rome was secure, its monarchy respected, its culture celebrated across Europe. The defeat of the Armada had elevated England's status as a rising power, even as Spain remained formidable. Yet Elizabeth's death in 1603 without an heir brought uncertainty once again. The Tudor line ended with her, and the throne passed to James VI of Scotland, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland under the Stuart dynasty. The Elizabethan era, remembered as a golden age, was a complex blend of triumph and challenge. It was an age of exploration, literature, and national pride, but also one of religious tension, poverty, and political intrigue. Its legacy lay in the consolidation of a Protestant national identity, the emergence of England as a maritime power, and the cultural achievements that defined its place in history. Stuart kings and civil war. When Elizabeth I died in 1603, she left no direct heir. The Tudor dynasty ended, and the crown passed to her nearest relative, James I of Scotland, who became James I of England. This succession united the crowns of England and Scotland under a single monarch for the first time, though the two kingdoms remained legally separate. The Stuart era began with hopes of stability after the long Tudor reign, but it soon revealed deep tensions, religious, political, and financial, that would ultimately tear the kingdom apart in civil war. James I, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, styled himself a believer in the divine right of kings, asserting that monarchs ruled by God's will and were accountable only to him. He sought to strengthen royal authority, but in England he faced a parliament increasingly conscious of its own rights, especially over taxation. Disputes soon arose over finances, foreign policy, and the extent of royal prerogative. Religious division was another source of conflict. England under Elizabeth had settled into a Protestant identity through the Church of England, but tensions remained. Catholics, marginalised and persecuted, hoped that James, the son of a Catholic mother, might be more tolerant. Instead, his rule continued restrictions, and plots emerged, the most famous being the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. A group of Catholic conspirators, including Guy Fawkes, planned to blow up the Houses of Parliament and kill the king. The plot was discovered, and its failure reinforced suspicion of Catholics, who remained distrusted for generations. At the same time, Puritans within the Church of England sought further reform, pressing for stricter Protestant practices and simpler worship. James resisted extremes on both sides, but his attempts at moderation satisfied few. His commissioning of the King James Bible, published in 1611, became one of the enduring achievements of his reign, providing a majestic English translation that shaped religious and literary culture. James's son, Charles I, succeeded him in 1625. Where James had clashed with Parliament, Charles quarrelled even more bitterly. He married a Catholic princess, Henrietta Maria of France, alarming his Protestant subjects. He levied taxes without parliamentary approval, such as forced loans and ship money, provoking widespread resentment. In 1628, Parliament presented him with the Petition of Right, demanding limits on arbitrary taxation and imprisonment. Charles reluctantly agreed, but soon dismissed Parliament and attempted to rule without it for 11 years, a period known as the Personal Rule. During this time, Charles relied on unpopular financial measures and enforced religious policies that angered Puritans. His Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, promoted reforms that emphasized ceremony and hierarchy, which many viewed as a drift toward Catholicism. Resistance grew, particularly in Scotland, where Charles attempted to impose a new prayer book in 1637. Riots broke out, leading to the Bishops' Wars, and Charles was forced to recall Parliament to raise funds. The recalled body, known as the Long Parliament, seized the opportunity to press its grievances. It demanded reforms, executed some of the king's ministers, and passed laws limiting royal authority. Tensions escalated, as neither king nor parliament would yield. In 1642, civil war broke out between the royalist supporters of the king, often drawn from the nobility and traditionalists, and the parliamentarians, who demanded limits on monarchy and were supported by Puritans, merchants, and many in the towns. The English Civil War unfolded in phases. Early battles were inconclusive, but over time the parliamentarians gained the advantage. Under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell and his New Model Army, Parliament developed a disciplined and ideologically motivated fighting force. At battles such as Marston Moor in 1644 and Naseby in 1645, Royalist forces were decisively defeated. Charles was captured, but negotiations broke down and fighting resumed. Eventually, the parliamentarians prevailed. In 1649, the conflict reached its shocking climax. Charles I was tried for treason, convicted, and executed outside the banqueting house in London. For the first time, an English king was publicly tried and put to death by his own subjects. The monarchy was abolished, and England was declared a commonwealth, governed as a republic. Cromwell emerged as the dominant figure, serving first as commander of the army and later as Lord Protector. His regime pursued Puritan reforms, enforced strict moral codes, and fought wars abroad, including brutal campaigns in Ireland. Yet his rule, though effective in some respects, was resented for its authoritarianism. After Cromwell's death in 1658, the Republic faltered. In 1660, the monarchy was restored under Charles II, son of the executed king. The Civil War and its aftermath left profound marks on England. The conflict was about more than monarchy versus parliament. It was about religion, governance, and the balance of power in society. It revealed deep divisions and tested the very foundations of authority. Though the monarchy was restored, it could never again claim absolute power. The precedent had been set. Kings ruled not by divine right alone, but in negotiation with their people and their representatives. The Stuart century, beginning with hopes of unity under James I and descending into the chaos of civil war, showed how fragile monarchy could be when faced with unresolved tensions. It also set the stage for further struggles in the later 17th century, as England continued to grapple with the balance between crown and parliament, liberty and authority, restoration and fire. When Charles II returned to England in 1660, the monarchy was restored after more than a decade of republican experiment. Crowds lined the streets to welcome him back. Bells rang from church towers, and celebrations erupted across the kingdom. The interregnum under Cromwell and his successors had brought military rule, Puritan austerity, and political uncertainty. Now, many hoped for a return to stability, tradition, and the familiar rhythms of monarchy. Yet the Restoration era was not merely a return to the past. It was a period of renewal, cultural vitality, and crisis, marked by plague, fire, and political intrigue. Charles II, son of the executed Charles I, was determined to avoid his father's fate. He presented himself as a king willing to compromise, to work with Parliament, and to respect the lessons of the Civil War. His charm and wit earned him the nickname the Merry Monarch. The austerity of Cromwell's Puritan regime gave way to a court known for its liveliness, pageantry, and openness to European influences. Theatres reopened, music flourished, and artists like Sir Peter Lely painted portraits of courtiers in a style of elegance and extravagance. Religious questions, however, remained unresolved. Charles himself leaned toward Catholic sympathies, influenced by his years of exile in France, but he recognized the need to maintain outward conformity to the Church of England. Parliament, dominated by Anglicans, enacted laws to enforce conformity and restrict dissent. The Clarendon Code imposed penalties on nonconformists, those who refused to accept the rights of the established church, while Catholics remained under suspicion. These measures reflected the lingering anxieties of the Civil War, when religious radicalism had fueled conflict. Despite political manoeuvring, England faced disasters that tested its resilience. In 1665, the Great Plague struck London. Bubonic plague had not disappeared from Europe, but this outbreak was the deadliest in England since the Black Death. Rats carrying fleas transmitted the disease through the crowded streets of the capital. Houses with plague victims were marked with painted crosses, their inhabitants shut inside. Death carts carried bodies to mass graves. Estimates suggest that as many as 100,000 Londoners, perhaps a quarter of the city's population, died within months. Normal life collapsed. Trade halted. Courts closed. and fear spread through every alley. As London began to recover, another calamity struck. In September 1666, a fire broke out in a bakery on Pudding Lane. Fueled by timber houses, narrow streets, and strong winds, the flames spread rapidly. For 4 days, fire consumed the city, destroying more than 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and countless businesses. St. Paul's Cathedral, a medieval landmark, was reduced to rubble. Tens of thousands were left homeless, and the capital was transformed into smouldering ruins. The Great Fire, though devastating, also cleared the way for renewal. Under the direction of architects such as Sir Christopher Wren, London was rebuilt with wider streets, brick houses, and grand new structures. Wren's new St. Paul's Cathedral, with its massive dome, became a symbol of the city's resilience and of a new age of architecture. Insurance companies, first created in response to the fire, marked the beginnings of modern financial systems. The disaster revealed both the fragility and the adaptability of urban life. While plague and fire scarred the Restoration, the era also saw advances in science and thought. The Royal Society, founded in 1660, gathered scholars and experimenters committed to studying the natural world. Figures such as Robert Hooke and Robert Boyle published discoveries in physics, chemistry, and biology. A generation later, Isaac Newton would revolutionize science with his laws of motion and gravitation, building on the intellectual foundations laid in this period. Foreign wars also shaped Charles's reign. England fought the Dutch in a series of naval conflicts, competing for dominance in trade and colonies. The wars were costly and often inconclusive, though they reflected England's growing role as a maritime power. Colonies in the Americas and the Caribbean expanded, with sugar plantations in the West Indies and settlements along the Atlantic seaboard fueling economic growth, often built on the back of enslaved labour. Politics remained contentious. The memory of civil war haunted both king and parliament, shaping debates over succession and authority. Charles's lack of a legitimate heir meant that his brother, James, Duke of York, was next in line. James's open Catholicism alarmed many, raising fears of a return to Catholic monarchy. Political factions emerged: the Whigs, who opposed James's succession, and the Tories, who supported hereditary right. These divisions would dominate politics in the decades to come. When Charles II died in 1685, the kingdom once again faced uncertainty. His brother James ascended as James II, bringing with him the Catholic sympathies that many had feared. Within a few years, conflict between king and parliament would escalate into what became known as the Glorious Revolution. The Restoration era had begun with celebrations and optimism, but it revealed the fragile balance of monarchy, religion, and parliament in post-Civil War England. It was a time of calamities, the plague and the fire that tested resilience, but also a time of renewal in science, architecture, and culture. The lessons of the 17th century were clear. Monarchy could return, but it could never again stand above the struggles of parliament, religion, and the people it sought to govern. Glorious Revolution Securis. When Charles II died in 1685, the crown passed to his brother James II. From the outset, his reign revived the anxieties that had troubled England for decades: the tension between monarchy and parliament, and above all, the question of religion. James was openly Catholic, at a time when Protestant identity had become a cornerstone of English politics and national life. His attempts to promote tolerance for Catholics and strengthen royal authority quickly set him on a collision course with his subjects. At first, James's rule seemed secure. He inherited a loyal standing army and enjoyed support from Tories, who valued hereditary monarchy. Early in his reign he crushed the Monmouth Rebellion, an uprising led by Charles II's illegitimate son, the Duke of Monmouth. At Sedgemoor in 1685, James's forces defeated the rebels, and brutal reprisals followed in the Bloody Assizes, overseen by Judge Jeffreys. Hundreds were executed or transported, demonstrating the Crown's willingness to enforce obedience. But James's broader policies alienated wide sections of society. He appointed Catholics to high offices in government, the army, and the universities, bypassing laws that restricted them. He issued declarations of indulgence, granting religious freedom not only to Catholics, but also to Protestant dissenters. Many Anglicans, while not hostile to toleration itself, feared that James's true aim was to re-establish Catholic dominance. Parliament grew increasingly alarmed. The birth of James's son in 1688 transformed the political situation. Until then, many had assumed that the king's Protestant daughter, Mary, married to the Dutch Protestant ruler William of Orange, would succeed him, limiting the danger of a Catholic dynasty. But the arrival of a male heir threatened to create a lasting Catholic line on the English throne. For many nobles and church leaders, this was unacceptable. In a remarkable act, a group of prominent English nobles secretly invited William of Orange to intervene. William landed in Devon in November 1688 with a substantial army. James, faced with desertions among his officers and wavering support, found himself unable to mount effective resistance. His authority crumbled, and he fled to France. The event was later remembered as the Glorious Revolution, not because it was bloodless, it involved tension and uncertainty, but because it avoided the kind of prolonged conflict that had torn the kingdom apart earlier in the century. In 1689, Parliament declared that James had abdicated by fleeing and offered the crown jointly to William and Mary. The new monarchs accepted under conditions that transformed the English constitution. The Bill of Rights, enacted the same year, established principles that limited royal power and asserted parliamentary supremacy. Among its provisions were guarantees of free elections, regular parliaments, and freedom of speech within Parliament. It prohibited the Crown from suspending laws without consent, levying taxes unilaterally, or maintaining a standing army in peacetime without parliamentary approval. The Glorious Revolution thus secured Protestant succession, enshrined parliamentary authority, and redefined monarchy as a constitutional institution. While kings and queens continued to rule, their power was now checked by law and by Parliament. The principle that the monarch ruled with the consent of the governed, expressed through their representatives, was firmly established. Religion was also reshaped. The Toleration Act of 1689 granted freedom of worship to most Protestant dissenters, though it excluded Catholics and non-Christians from full rights. The Church of England remained the established church, but the age of rigid conformity began to soften. Religious pluralism, though limited, became part of English life. The Revolution also had broader consequences. It bound England more closely to the Protestant powers of Europe, particularly the Dutch Republic. William, already a leader in the struggle against Catholic France, drew England into continental wars against Louis XIV. England's navy expanded, and financial innovations, such as the creation of the Bank of England in 1694, laid foundations for future economic strength. For ordinary people, the immediate effects of the Glorious Revolution were less dramatic than for elites, but the settlement created a more stable political environment. Memories of civil war and authoritarian rule were fresh, and the new balance between Crown and Parliament offered a measure of security. The monarchy continued, but no king or queen could again attempt absolute power in the manner of the early Stuarts. In retrospect, the Glorious Revolution was one of the pivotal moments in English history. It secured parliamentary sovereignty, Protestant succession, and constitutional monarchy. Its legacy would shape political thought not only in Britain, but also abroad, influencing the American colonists a century later and contributing to ideas of government rooted in consent, law, and rights. The 17th century had begun with the lofty claims of divine right under James I, and ended with the Bill of Rights under William and Mary. In less than 100 years, England had moved from monarchy contested by civil war to monarchy constrained by law, a transformation that defined the modern British state. Empire and Enlightenment. The 18th century opened with England transformed into a constitutional monarchy after the Glorious Revolution. The Bill of Rights of 1689 had established Parliament as the central authority in government, ensuring that monarchs could not rule without its consent. The crown remained a potent symbol, but real power increasingly shifted to ministers and elected representatives. This new balance coincided with an era of global expansion, intellectual ferment, and social change that reshaped Britain's place in the world. The succession was the first challenge. When William III died in 1702, his wife Mary having predeceased him, the throne passed to Mary's sister Anne. Anne's reign saw the final union of England and Scotland. The two kingdoms, long linked by a shared monarch since 1603, formally joined under the Act of Union in 1707, creating the Kingdom of Great Britain. The Scottish Parliament was dissolved, and representation moved to Westminster. Economically, the Union opened English colonial markets to Scottish merchants, laying the foundation for Scotland's role in imperial trade. Politically, it created a single state with ambitions far beyond the island. Anne's reign was also shaped by war. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701-1714, drew Britain into a continental struggle against France and Spain. The Duke of Marlborough won major victories at Blenheim, Ramillies, and Oudenarde, securing Britain's reputation as a military power. Naval strength expanded, ensuring control of trade routes. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 brought Britain valuable gains: Gibraltar, Minorca, and trade rights in Spanish America. These acquisitions signalled the growing importance of overseas empire in national policy. When Anne died childless in 1714, the crown passed under the Act of Settlement to the Protestant House of Hanover. George I, a German prince, spoke little English and relied heavily on ministers. His accession deepened the shift of power from monarch to parliament. Real authority increasingly resided in the cabinet, led by figures such as Robert Walpole, often regarded as Britain's first prime minister. The system of constitutional monarchy took clearer shape, with Parliament controlling taxation and policy, while the monarch reigned with diminishing executive power. Britain's overseas empire grew steadily during the 18th century. Colonies in North America expanded. The Caribbean produced immense wealth through sugar plantations worked by enslaved Africans, and India became a theatre of competition with France. The Royal Navy protected trade routes, fought wars, and projected power across the globe. London became a hub of finance and commerce, with institutions like the Bank of England funding government debt and enabling military campaigns. The empire enriched merchants and investors, but its profits were built on exploitation, slavery, and conquest. Domestically, the 18th century was an age of enlightenment. Intellectual life flourished, shaped by reason, science, and debate. Coffee houses became centres of discussion, where pamphlets, newspapers, and books circulated widely. Writers such as John Locke, though earlier, continued to influence ideas of government and liberty. Isaac Newton's scientific legacy inspired further inquiry into the natural world. Joseph Addison, Alexander Pope, and Jonathan Swift contributed to a vibrant literary culture, while later thinkers such as David Hume and Adam Smith in Scotland advanced philosophy and economics. Education and print culture expanded. Literacy rates rose, and newspapers provided regular commentary on politics and society. The public sphere of debate allowed ideas to circulate beyond court and church, giving rise to a more informed and critical populace. The Enlightenment spirit also fostered calls for reform. Though political power remained concentrated among landowning elites, the social order was stratified but changing. The landed aristocracy and gentry dominated politics, while urban merchants and professionals gained influence through commerce. The working, poor, rural labourers and artisans formed the majority, their lives shaped by agriculture, seasonal employment, and growing urbanisation. The beginnings of industrial change appeared, with advances in textiles, coal mining, and metallurgy laying groundwork for the future industrial revolution. Religion remained important, but the 18th century saw greater diversity and toleration. The Church of England retained its privileged position, yet dissenting groups like Methodists, Baptists, and Quakers grew in number. John Wesley and the Methodist movement emphasized personal faith revivalist preaching, and outreach to the poor, challenging established patterns of worship. The expansion of religious pluralism reflected the broader currents of Enlightenment toleration. Britain's political system matured through both stability and conflict. Party politics solidified, with Whigs and Tories contesting elections and shaping policy. Corruption was widespread, with patronage and bribery influencing results. But the very existence of regular elections and parliamentary debate distinguished Britain from many European monarchies. The system was imperfect, but it allowed space for opposition and reform that would prove vital in later centuries. Abroad, Britain's rivalry with France dominated foreign affairs. The 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, became the first truly global conflict, fought in Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia. British victories under leaders like William Pitt the Elder secured Canada from France and laid the foundations of dominance in India through the East India Company. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 confirmed Britain's status as a global imperial power. Yet success carried costs. The empire required taxation, military defence, and administration, straining government finances. Efforts to raise revenue from the American colonies after 1763 sparked resistance, leading ultimately to revolution. By the close of the century, Britain would lose its 13 colonies, even as it gained new ones elsewhere. The 18th century, therefore, was an era of both enlightenment and empire. Ideas of liberty, science, and reason flourished, at the same time as Britain expanded through conquest, slavery, and commerce. The balance of monarchy and parliament shifted decisively toward constitutional government, while overseas trade and colonial rivalry defined Britain's global position. It was an age of contradiction, rational inquiry, alongside exploitation, liberty proclaimed while denied to millions in bondage. This complex legacy laid the foundation for the Britain of the 19th century, a nation at the forefront of industrial change, political reform, and imperial expansion. But in the 18th century, it was still shaping its identity as both a constitutional monarchy and a global power. American revolt and loss. By the mid-18th century, Britain's empire stretched across the Atlantic, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. The 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, had confirmed its status as a global power. Victory over France brought Canada, dominance in India, and vast new responsibilities. Yet this triumph also sowed the seeds of crisis. The costs of global war left Britain with heavy debts, and its leaders sought to make the American colonies contribute more to imperial defence. What followed was a conflict that shattered Britain's first empire and transformed its relationship with its overseas dominions. The American colonies had grown rapidly during the 17th and 18th centuries. Settlers from Britain and Europe, enslaved Africans forced into labour, and indigenous peoples all formed part of a diverse and often tense frontier world. By 1763, the colonies were prosperous and populous, with thriving ports like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Though loyal to the crown, colonists had long enjoyed a measure of self-government through local assemblies. Many saw themselves as freeborn Englishmen entitled to the rights established in Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights. After the 7 Years' War, the British government tightened control. New taxes and regulations, such as the Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765, provoked resistance. Colonists protested that they were taxed without representation in Parliament, coining the rallying cry, "No taxation without representation." Boycotts, petitions, and riots spread. Parliament eventually repealed the Stamp Act, but asserted its right to legislate for the colonies, in all cases whatsoever. The conflict deepened rather than resolved. The Boston Massacre of 1770 and the Boston Tea Party of 1773 became flashpoints. In the latter, colonists disguised as Native Americans dumped chests of British tea into the harbour, defying the Crown. Britain responded with the Coercive Acts, tightening control and punishing Massachusetts. What had begun as disputes over taxation evolved into a wider struggle over authority, rights, and identity. In 1775, fighting broke out at Lexington and Concord. Colonial militias clashed with British troops, and the War for Independence began. The colonies formed the Continental Congress, appointing George Washington as commander of their army. A year later, in July 1776, they declared independence, adopting Thomas Jefferson's Declaration, which proclaimed natural rights and government by consent of the governed. Britain at first expected a swift victory. It possessed a powerful army and navy, and many in London believed the rebels were disorganized. Yet the war proved difficult. The vastness of America, the resilience of colonial forces, and the determination of local communities prolonged the conflict. Washington avoided decisive defeat, keeping his army intact through hardship at Valley Forge and other campaigns. Guerrilla tactics and local support hindered British advances. International intervention shifted the balance. France, eager to avenge its defeat in the 7 Years' War, allied with the Americans in 1778, providing troops, supplies, and naval support. Spain and the Dutch Republic also joined against Britain. The conflict became global once again, stretching British resources thin. Battles raged not only in America but also in the Caribbean, India, and at sea. The turning point came at Yorktown in 1781. Surrounded by American and French forces, the British army under General Cornwallis was forced to surrender. Though fighting continued elsewhere, the defeat convinced Britain that the war could not be won. Negotiations led to the Treaty of Paris in 1783, recognizing the independence of the United States. The loss of the 13 colonies was a profound shock. For the first time, Britain had been defeated by its own settlers. The first British Empire, built in North America, was gone. Yet the defeat did not end Britain's imperial ambitions. Instead, it redirected them. Focus turned to the Caribbean, India, and later to Australia and Africa. Naval power remained strong, and the expansion of trade continued. At home, the loss prompted reflection. Some saw it as a failure of governance, proof that coercion could not bind colonies that valued self-rule. Others argued it was the inevitable result of distance and differing interests. The ideals of liberty and representation voiced by American revolutionaries resonated in Britain too, influencing reform movements and debates over political rights. For ordinary Britons, the war brought hardship through higher taxes and disrupted trade, but it also stimulated industry and naval expansion. In the long run, Britain recovered economically, while the United States embarked on its experiment in republican government. The American War of Independence marked a turning point in global history. It created a new nation built on Enlightenment ideals, even as slavery and inequality endured within it. For Britain, it ended one chapter of empire, but opened another. Freed from the costs of governing the 13 colonies, Britain would focus more on Asia, the Pacific, and later Africa, constructing what became the Second British Empire. Thus, out of loss came renewal. Britain's empire would expand again in the 19th century, reaching a scale far beyond what had been lost in America. Yet the memory of rebellion remained a warning. Colonies with strong identities and aspirations could not be ruled by force alone. Industrial revolution transforms. By the late 18th century, Britain stood at the edge of a transformation more profound than any war or political upheaval. The Industrial Revolution, beginning in the mid-1700s and accelerating through the 19th century, it altered every aspect of life, work, family, cities, trade, and the very environment. It marked the shift from an agrarian society rooted in manual labour to an industrial economy powered by machines, coal, and steam. Few moments in history reshaped a nation so completely. The roots of industrialization lay in agriculture. During the 18th century, the agricultural revolution had already begun to change rural life. Enclosure Acts reorganized open fields into consolidated farms, enabling landowners to experiment with new crops, crop rotations, and improved livestock breeding. Figures such as Jethro Tull promoted innovations like the seed drill, while selective breeding increased yields of cattle and sheep. The result was rising productivity, which freed labour from the land and provided surplus food to sustain growing towns. Yet enclosure also displaced many rural families, driving them into cities in search of work. The textile industry led the way in mechanization. Traditional spinning and weaving were laborious, carried out in cottages by hand. New inventions revolutionized production. John Kay's flying shuttle, 1733, sped up weaving. James Hargreaves' spinning jenny, 1764, allowed one worker to spin multiple threads at once. Richard Arkwright's water frame, 1769, harnessed water power for stronger yarn, and Samuel Crompton's spinning mule, 1779, combined innovations for fine, strong thread. Textile mills rose along rivers, drawing workers into factory labour. Cotton, imported from colonies, became the lifeblood of these industries, linking Britain's industrialisation to global networks of trade and slavery. Power was the crucial factor. Watermills provided early energy, but coal soon became central. Britain's abundant coalfields fueled furnaces, engines, and homes. Iron production expanded with new techniques, such as Abraham Darby's use of coke to smelt iron more cheaply. Bridges, machines, and tools multiplied. James Watt's improvements to the steam engine in the 1772 transformed power itself. Steam engines drove textile machinery, pumped water from mines, and eventually propelled locomotives and ships. By the early 19th century, steam and coal defined the industrial landscape. Transportation was revolutionized. Canals were dug to move coal, iron, and goods efficiently. Roads improved with turnpike trusts, paving the way for faster travel. Railways then transformed movement entirely. George Stephenson's locomotives in the 1822nd demonstrated the power of steam on rails. The opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1830 inaugurated the railway age, shrinking distances, lowering transport costs, and binding regions together. Railways also created new industries, iron rails, engines, carriages, and stimulated demand for coal and steel. Cities swelled as rural migrants and immigrants poured into industrial centres. Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, and Sheffield expanded rapidly, becoming symbols of industrial might. London too grew into a sprawling metropolis, its docks filled with goods from around the world. Yet urban growth brought squalor as well as prosperity. Overcrowded housing, poor sanitation, and polluted air plagued workers' districts. Disease spread quickly in cramped conditions, and mortality rates in industrial towns often exceeded those in the countryside. For workers, industrialization meant profound changes. The rhythm of agricultural life, tied to seasons, gave way to the regimented time of the factory bell. Men, women, and children laboured long hours, often in dangerous conditions. Child labour was widespread, with boys and girls tending machines or hauling coal. Wages were low, discipline strict, and accidents common. Yet industrial work also offered new opportunities, regular wages, access to goods, and the chance for skilled workers to rise. Responses to these conditions varied. Some celebrated industrial progress as a source of national strength. Others condemned its human cost. Writers like Charles Dickens vividly depicted the harshness of urban poverty. Reformers campaigned for laws to limit child labour, improve safety, and provide education. Over time, legislation such as the Factory Acts regulated working hours, especially for women and children. Trade unions began to organise, pressing for higher wages and better conditions, though often facing resistance from employers and government. Industrialisation also reshaped society more broadly. A new middle class emerged: factory owners, merchants, engineers, and professionals who valued hard work, education, and respectability. Their rise challenged the traditional dominance of the landed aristocracy. Meanwhile, the working class grew in numbers and consciousness, forging identities through labour, community, and eventually politics. The intellectual climate reflected these changes. Economists such as Adam Smith championed free markets and the invisible hand of competition. Others, like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, writing later in the century, criticized capitalism's inequalities and called for revolutionary change. Debates over wealth, poverty, and progress became central to public life. Globally, the Industrial Revolution made Britain the workshop of the world. Its factories produced textiles, iron, and manufactured goods on an unprecedented scale, exported across the globe. Colonies supplied raw materials, cotton from India and the American South, sugar from the Caribbean, wool from Australia, and provided markets for finished goods. Britain's naval power ensured control of trade routes, while financial institutions in London underpinned global commerce. Environmental consequences were profound. Coal smoke blackened skies, rivers ran polluted, and landscapes were scarred by mines and factories. While contemporaries celebrated industry's achievements, the costs to health and environment were immense, legacies that remain visible today. By the early 19th century, Britain had been utterly transformed. Industrialization created wealth, power, and innovation on a scale never before seen. It also generated inequality, hardship, and new forms of social conflict. The Industrial Revolution was not a single event, but an ongoing process that reshaped every aspect of life. It propelled Britain into global leadership, but also posed challenges that would define the modern age. Empire at its height. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain had become the most powerful nation on earth. The Industrial Revolution had given it unmatched economic might. Its navy commanded the seas, and its colonies spanned the globe. The phrase, "the empire on which the sun never sets," captured both the vastness of British dominion and the confidence of its people. This was the high tide of the British Empire, an era when Britain believed itself destined to rule, trade, and civilize across continents. The empire's foundation rested on maritime supremacy. The Royal Navy, expanded and modernized, protected trade routes, suppressed piracy, and enforced Britain's interests from the Caribbean to the Pacific. Naval bases such as Gibraltar, Malta, Singapore, and Hong Kong served as key outposts, allowing British ships to resupply and project power across oceans. Britain's fleets ensured that no rival could challenge its dominance for long. Economically, Britain was the workshop of the world. Its factories produced textiles, machinery, and manufactured goods in enormous quantities. Coal and iron drove industry, while new technologies, steamships, telegraphs, and railways connected empire and commerce more tightly than ever before. Colonies supplied raw materials essential to industry: cotton from India and Egypt, tea from Ceylon, sugar from the Caribbean, wool from Australia, and gold from South Africa. In return, British goods flooded colonial markets, binding distant economies to London. India stood at the heart of the empire. After the decline of the Mughal Empire, the British East India Company extended its control through alliances, wars, and annexations. By the early 19th century, large parts of India were under company rule, with British officials, merchants, and soldiers entrenched in power. Indian society was reshaped by new laws, taxes, and trade. The introduction of English education, railways, and telegraphs created lasting changes, but exploitation and cultural friction bred resentment. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, sparked by grievances among soldiers, sepoys, and fueled by broader discontent, shook British authority. Though suppressed, it marked a turning point. The East India Company was abolished, and India came under direct crown rule as the jewel in the crown of the empire. In Africa, Britain established colonies and trading posts along the coast, later expanding inland. The abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself in 1833 marked a moral shift, though economic interests remained central. British merchants turned from human cargo to palm oil, ivory, and later minerals. Missionaries spread Christianity, schools, and Western medicine, often intertwined with imperial expansion. Exploration by figures such as David Livingstone and Richard Burton opened Africa's interior to European imagination and ambition. In the Americas, Britain retained possessions in the Caribbean, where sugar plantations, now worked by freed labourers after emancipation, continued to supply wealth. Canada, lost partly in the American Revolution, was consolidated into a self-governing dominion after 1867, tied by loyalty to the Crown but increasingly autonomous. Australia and New Zealand grew rapidly as settler colonies, with indigenous peoples displaced and marginalised. Penal transportation to Australia gave way to waves of migration, and gold rushes spurred prosperity. At home, empire influenced every aspect of life. Tea became a national beverage, cotton textiles clothed the masses, and exotic goods filled shops. Exhibitions such as the Great Exhibition of 1851 at the Crystal Palace celebrated industrial might and imperial reach, displaying products and raw materials from across the globe. Maps shaded red reinforced the sense of Britain's global destiny. Yet empire was not without its critics. Some condemned its exploitation of peoples and resources. Others questioned its moral justification. Debates over free trade, protectionism, and the responsibilities of empire animated parliament and public opinion. The anti-slavery movement, humanitarian campaigns, and missionary societies framed empire as a vehicle for moral improvement, even as economic interests often drove expansion. The empire also shaped identity. Britons increasingly saw themselves as part of a global mission, bringing progress and civilization. This ideology masked the realities of conquest, subjugation, and cultural loss experienced by colonized peoples. Resistance existed everywhere, from Indian rebels to African communities and Caribbean intellectuals, but the machinery of empire was vast, backed by industry, money, and force. Socially, the empire offered opportunities for individuals. Young men sought careers as soldiers, administrators, or traders abroad. Wealth flowed back in the form of fortunes made in India or the colonies. Families of officers and officials carried imperial culture, blending experiences of Britain and the wider world. Writers and explorers fed popular imagination with tales of distant lands, shaping literature and public opinion. By the late 19th century, Britain controlled a quarter of the world's land and population. Its empire was larger than any in history, touching every continent. The empire provided prestige, wealth, and strategic advantage, but it also created tensions. The costs of defense were immense. Rival powers such as Germany and the United States were rising, and colonized peoples increasingly questioned foreign rule. The very scale that made the empire formidable also made it vulnerable. Still, for Victorians of the mid-century, the empire seemed permanent, a natural extension of Britain's industrial and naval supremacy. It was the defining feature of national life, shaping politics, culture, and economy alike. In the glow of the Crystal Palace, in the spread of railways across India, in the ships crowding London's docks, the empire at its height projected an image of confidence and control. But history would reveal that no empire is eternal. Even at its zenith, the seeds of challenge and decline were already sown. Victorian Age and Reform. When Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837 at just 18 years old, few could have predicted that her reign would last more than 60 years and become one of the defining eras of British history. The Victorian Age, spanning until her death in 1901, witnessed sweeping changes in politics, society, economy, and culture. It was a period of reform at home, expansion abroad, and deep contradictions between progress and hardship. Victoria herself became a powerful symbol of continuity and respectability. Though not directly involved in daily politics, her presence lent stability to a rapidly changing nation. Her long marriage to Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha embodied ideals of domesticity, family, and moral seriousness. After Albert's death in 1861, Victoria withdrew from public life, earning criticism for her seclusion. But in time she re-emerged as a revered matriarch, the grandmother of Europe, linked by blood to royal houses across the continent. Politically, the Victorian era was marked by gradual reform. In 1832, just before Victoria's reign, the Great Reform Act had expanded the electorate, reducing the dominance of rotten boroughs and giving more representation to growing towns. Further reform acts followed in 1867 and 1884, steadily widening the franchise to include much of the male working class. Though far from universal suffrage, these changes shifted Britain toward a more democratic system. The rise of political parties also transformed governance. The Whigs evolved into the Liberal Party, championing reform, free trade, and individual liberty. The Tories became the Conservative Party, defending tradition, the Church, and the Empire. Leaders such as William Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli defined Victorian politics with their rival visions. Gladstone's moral earnestness and reforms in education and civil service, Disraeli's emphasis on empire and social cohesion. Parliamentary debates, reported in a growing press, engaged an increasingly literate public. Industrialization, begun in the previous century, reached its peak. Britain was the world's foremost industrial nation, producing textiles, steel, and machinery in vast quantities. Railways crisscrossed the country, linking towns and cities, carrying goods and passengers at unprecedented speed. Telegraph wires connected Britain to its colonies, while steamships shortened travel across oceans. London became a global hub of finance and trade, its docks receiving goods from every corner of the empire. Yet industrial progress brought social challenges. Urbanization continued, with millions living in crowded cities. Slums, poor sanitation, and disease were common. Reformers campaigned for clean water, sewer systems, and housing improvements. Public health acts in the mid-19th century began to address these problems, while figures like Florence Nightingale redefined nursing and healthcare. The growth of trade unions gave workers a voice, pressing for better wages, shorter hours, and safer conditions. Education expanded dramatically. The 1870 Education Act laid the groundwork for universal elementary schooling, reflecting the belief that literacy was essential for citizenship and industrial progress. Newspapers and periodicals flourished, spreading news, debate, and literature to a mass audience. Literacy allowed the working classes to participate more fully in political and cultural life. The Victorian era was also an age of scientific discovery and intellectual challenge. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, 1859, revolutionized understanding of life, sparking debates about evolution, faith, and humanity's place in nature. Advances in geology, chemistry, and physics expanded knowledge, while engineers built bridges, tunnels, and ships that showcased technological mastery. The Victorian spirit of inquiry was both confident and anxious, embracing progress while questioning traditional certainties. Culturally, the period produced some of Britain's most celebrated literature. Novelists such as Charles Dickens, George Eliot, the Bronte sisters, Thomas Hardy, and Anthony Trollope explored the complexities of society, class, and morality. Their works depicted both the struggles of the poor and the dilemmas of the middle classes, capturing the texture of Victorian life. Poetry flourished with Alfred Tennyson, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and later, Gerard Manley Hopkins. The theatre and music halls entertained growing urban audiences, reflecting both high culture and popular tastes. Empire remained central to Victorian identity. Disraeli proclaimed Victoria Empress of India in 1877, reflecting Britain's pride in its colonial possessions. The empire expanded into Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, justified by the rhetoric of a civilizing mission. Missionaries, soldiers, and administrators carried British influence far beyond Europe. At the same time, resistance in colonies such as the Indian Rebellion of 1857 revealed the tensions and violence inherent in imperial rule. Women's roles began to shift. The ideal of domesticity placed them at the heart of family life, but campaigns for women's rights gained momentum. The suffrage movement, though not yet victorious, laid foundations for future progress. Women entered professions such as teaching and nursing, and reformers like Josephine Butler campaigned against laws that oppressed women. The contradictions of the Victorian Age were stark. It was an era of wealth and poverty, moral seriousness and hypocrisy, reform and repression. The workhouses of the Poor Law stood alongside the grandeur of the Crystal Palace, built for the Great Exhibition of 1851 to showcase Britain's industrial and imperial might. Optimism in progress coexisted with anxiety about social unrest, crime, and the loss of faith. By the time of Victoria's death in 1901, Britain had changed beyond recognition from the world she had inherited in 1837. The monarchy was deeply entrenched as a national symbol. Parliament was more democratic. Cities dominated life, and the empire spanned the globe. The Victorian Age was remembered as both a golden era of progress and a time of profound challenge, laying the foundations for the modern Britain of the 20th century. World War I, sacrifice. The dawn of the 20th century brought optimism to Britain. The nation stood at the height of its imperial power, its navy unrivaled, its industries still formidable, and its empire stretching across continents. King Edward VII succeeded Queen Victoria in 1901, presiding over the so-called Edwardian age of elegance, prosperity, and relative peace. Yet beneath the surface lay tensions, rivalries in Europe, demands for reform at home, and the struggles of colonies abroad. In 1914, those tensions erupted into the First World War, a conflict that would devastate Britain, reshape society, and mark the beginning of the end for the old imperial order. The roots of war lay in Europe's balance of power. Germany had risen rapidly as an industrial and military force, rivaling Britain in trade and naval strength. Alliances divided the continent. Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire on one side, France, Russia, and later Britain on the other. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June 1914 set events in motion. When Germany invaded Belgium in August, Britain, bound by treaty to defend Belgian neutrality, declared war. The initial enthusiasm was immense. Crowds cheered in the streets, and thousands of men rushed to enlist, convinced the war would be over by Christmas. Britain's professional army, the Old Contemptibles, was small compared to continental forces, but highly trained. It fought valiantly in early battles such as Mons and the Marne, but soon the war settled into stalemate. Trenches stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland, and soldiers faced a brutal war of attrition. Conditions on the Western Front were grim. Soldiers lived in mud-filled trenches, exposed to cold, lice, and shell fire. The constant roar of artillery, the stench of decay, and the threat of gas attacks defined daily life. Battles such as the Somme in 1916 and Passchendaele in 1917 epitomized the horror. Hundreds of thousands killed or wounded for small gains of ground. The war introduced modern weaponry on an unprecedented scale. Machine guns, poison gas, tanks, and airplanes. It was industrialized slaughter. The cost in human lives was staggering. Over 700,000 British soldiers died, with millions more wounded. Entire towns and villages lost much of a generation of young men. Memorials, cenotaphs, and rolls of honour appeared in churches and town squares across the country, reflecting grief that touched every community. The image of fields of poppies growing over the graves of the fallen became an enduring symbol of remembrance. The war was not fought only by soldiers. Civilians played a crucial role in sustaining the effort. Women entered factories, offices, and farms in large numbers, producing munitions, driving buses, and filling roles once reserved for men. The Women's Land Army worked fields, while nurses tended the wounded near the front. The war accelerated social change, demonstrating women's ability to contribute beyond domestic roles and strengthening campaigns for suffrage. At sea, the Royal Navy blockaded Germany, cutting off supplies and weakening its economy. German U-boats threatened Britain's lifelines, sinking merchant ships in the Atlantic. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 with American passengers aboard, helped draw the United States closer to intervention. By 1917, unrestricted submarine warfare and the entry of America tipped the balance toward the Allies. The Empire played a decisive role. Troops from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, and beyond fought in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Colonial soldiers endured the same horrors as British troops, while their sacrifices deepened debates about loyalty, autonomy, and independence. Battles such as Gallipoli, where Anzac troops suffered heavy losses, forged national identities within the empire. The war also strained politics at home. Prime Minister H.H. Asquith gave way to David Lloyd George in 1916 as coalition government sought to manage the crisis. The state assumed unprecedented control over the economy, industry, and daily life. Rationing, conscription, and censorship reshaped society. The Defence of the Realm Act curtailed freedoms but ensured mobilization for total war. By 1918, exhaustion was everywhere. Germany launched a desperate offensive in the spring, but Allied counterattacks, bolstered by fresh American troops, pushed the front back. On the 11th of November, 1918, the armistice ended the fighting. Britain rejoiced, but the toll was immense. The war to end all wars left a generation scarred and a society transformed. In the aftermath, Britain faced both triumph and burden. It emerged a victor, expanding its empire with former German colonies and Ottoman territories under League of Nations mandates. Yet victory was hollow. The economy was strained by debt, industries weakened by competition, and political unrest simmered. Strikes, demands for Irish independence, and the struggles of returning veterans defined the post-war years. The legacy of sacrifice was profound. The war reinforced the role of Parliament and government in managing society, advanced women's rights with the extension of the vote in 1918, and deepened scepticism about war itself. The poetry of Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon captured the disillusionment of a generation, challenging notions of glory. The cenotaph in Whitehall, unveiled in 1920, and the tomb of the unknown warrior in Westminster Abbey became sites of national mourning. World War I marked a turning point. It shattered the optimism of the Edwardian age, drained Britain's resources, and planted doubts about the durability of empire. It was a war of sacrifice, endured by soldiers and civilians alike, that reshaped Britain's identity in the 20th century. World War II and resilience. The interwar years left Britain both proud of victory and burdened by its cost. The 1922nd and 1932nd brought economic hardship, unemployment, and political strain. The Great Depression hit industries hard, while the empire faced growing calls for independence from Ireland, India, and other colonies. Amid these difficulties, a new threat arose on the European continent. Adolf Hitler's rise in Germany, with his aggressive expansion and ideology of conquest, posed a challenge greater even than that of 1914. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain declared war once more. At first, the conflict seemed distant. The phony war of 1939-40 passed with little fighting in Western Europe. But in May 1940, German forces swept through the Low Countries and France with stunning speed. The British Expeditionary Force was forced into retreat, culminating in the evacuation of more than 300,000 soldiers from Dunkirk. Though much equipment was lost, the successful evacuation preserved Britain's army. France soon fell, leaving Britain to face Nazi Germany alone. The summer of 1940 brought the Battle of Britain, a contest for control of the skies. The Luftwaffe bombed airfields, cities, and factories, seeking to prepare for invasion. Britain's Royal Air Force, using radar and the bravery of the few, repelled the attacks. Winston Churchill, newly appointed Prime Minister, rallied the nation with words that became legendary. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The German invasion never came, but the bombing did not cease. The Blitz, beginning in September 1940, brought nightly air raids to London and other cities. Families sheltered in underground stations, emerging to find their streets reduced to rubble. Firefighters and volunteers struggled to contain the devastation. Coventry, Liverpool, and many industrial towns were heavily hit. Civilians endured shortages, rationing, and constant fear, but their resilience became a hallmark of the war effort. The phrase, "keep calm and carry on," though little used at the time, later came to symbolize this spirit. The war was truly global. In North Africa, British and Commonwealth troops fought against German and Italian forces. In the Atlantic, the Navy and merchant fleet battled U-boats to keep supply lines open. In Asia, Japan's entry into the war in 1941 brought disaster, with the fall of Singapore long considered an impregnable fortress, marking a humiliating defeat. Yet British, Indian, and other imperial troops continued to resist in Burma and the Pacific. The turning point came through alliance and endurance. Britain received vital aid from the United States through the Lend-Lease program before America formally entered the war. After Pearl Harbor, the US became a full partner, joining Britain and the Soviet Union in the Grand Alliance. Together, they mounted offensives that gradually pushed the Axis powers back. For ordinary Britons, the home front was a battlefield of its own. Rationing ensured fair distribution of scarce food, while women took on roles in factories, agriculture, and the armed services. The Women's Land Army worked fields, while the Auxiliary Territorial Service supported the military. Children were evacuated from cities to the countryside, separated from families for safety. Blackouts, air raid drills, and civil defence became part of daily routine. By 1944, preparations were underway for the liberation of Europe. On the 6th of June D-Day, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy. British, Canadian, and American troops established a foothold, beginning the liberation of France. The campaign pushed into the Low Countries and Germany itself. In May 1945, Germany surrendered, and Europe rejoiced. Churchill announced victory in Europe, though the war against Japan continued until the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki later that year. Britain emerged victorious, but exhausted. The war had strained its economy, destroyed much of its infrastructure, and left millions grieving. Yet it also forged a sense of unity and resilience. The shared hardships of the Blitz, rationing, and military service created a spirit of common purpose. The Empire had rallied in defence, with troops from India, Africa, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand playing crucial roles. The political consequences were immediate. In 1945, Clement Attlee's Labour Party won a landslide election, defeating Churchill. The public, weary of sacrifice, sought not only victory, but also renewal. The new government embarked on radical reforms, creating the National Health Service, expanding welfare, and rebuilding housing and industry. Out of war came a vision of a fairer society. World War II marked the peak of Britain's ordeal and its finest hour. It confirmed the nation's role as a global power and moral force, standing against tyranny. Yet it also revealed the limits of empire. The war left Britain indebted to the United States, dependent on aid, and less able to maintain global dominance. In the decades that followed, decolonization and economic challenges would reshape its role in the world. Still, the resilience of the British people in 1939-45 became an enduring part of national memory. From Dunkirk to the Blitz, from El Alamein to D-Day, the sacrifices of that generation defined Britain's 20th century. Their endurance, courage, and unity ensured that, though battered, the nation survived to fight another day and to rebuild in peace. Post-war Britain rebuilds. The end of World War II in 1945 brought relief and celebration, but also daunting challenges. Britain had emerged victorious, yet the cost of victory was immense. Cities lay scarred by bombing, industries were worn, and the economy was drained by 6 years of total war. The empire, once the symbol of unrivaled power, now faced rising demands for independence. Post-war Britain entered a period of reconstruction, reform, and redefinition that would shape the nation into the modern state we know today. Clement Attlee's Labour government, elected in 1945, set out an ambitious programme of social reform. At its heart was the creation of the welfare state. The Beveridge Report of 1942 had identified 5 giants to be defeated: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. Labour took this vision and translated it into policy. In 1948, the National Health Service, NHS, was established under Aneurin Bevan, providing free medical care to all citizens, funded by taxation. Hospitals, doctors, and nurses became accessible regardless of wealth, transforming healthcare in Britain. Alongside the NHS came expanded welfare benefits, national insurance, and support for families. Council housing programmes rebuilt bombed-out areas and addressed slum conditions. Education reforms extended schooling, raising the school-leaving age and broadening opportunities. For millions, these measures represented a new social contract, that the state would provide security from cradle to grave. Economically, Britain faced hardship. The war had left it heavily indebted to the United States, and rationing continued into the 1952. Coal shortages, rebuilding costs, and competition from rising economies strained recovery. Yet investment in nationalised industries, coal, steel, railways, and utilities, sought to modernise the economy. Martial aid from the United States helped stabilise finances, while trade within the Commonwealth and with Europe slowly revived growth. The empire entered its final chapter. India, the jewel in the crown, achieved independence in 1947, partitioned into India and Pakistan. Other colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean followed over the coming decades. Decolonization was sometimes negotiated peacefully, sometimes marred by conflict, but the momentum was unstoppable. Britain shifted from ruling empire to leading the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of former colonies. The loss of empire was both a blow to prestige and an opportunity to redefine Britain's role in a changing world. The 1952nd and 1962nd brought both recovery and transformation. A new consumer society emerged, with rising living standards, televisions, cars, and household appliances entering ordinary homes. Youth culture flourished, from rock and roll to the Beatles, reshaping global popular culture. Immigration from the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa brought new communities, enriching British life, but also sparking tensions that required adjustments in identity and policy. Internationally, Britain remained influential, but no longer dominant. The Suez Crisis of 1956 revealed the limits of British power as American pressure forced withdrawal from Egypt. Membership in NATO, and later the European Economic Community, tied Britain to new alliances, while the special relationship with the United States remained central. The Cold War defined foreign policy, with Britain balancing nuclear deterrence, alliances, and diplomacy. Politically, alternating Conservative and Labour governments steered the country through modernisation, welfare expansion, and debates over economic management. Trade unions played a powerful role, while debates over class, privilege, and equality shaped discourse. In Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, demands for self-government simmered, foreshadowing future constitutional changes. Culturally, post-war Britain saw creativity and innovation. Literature, film, theatre, and music captured the hopes and anxieties of a society in flux. Writers like George Orwell, Doris Lessing, and later Salman Rushdie explored themes of power, identity, and change. The arts reflected both nostalgia for empire and excitement for new beginnings. By the end of the 20th century, Britain had reinvented itself. The empire was gone, but the country remained a global player through diplomacy, finance, culture, and alliances. The welfare state, the NHS, and democratic institutions became cornerstones of national identity. Britain had endured the upheavals of 2 world wars, navigated the loss of empire, and reshaped itself as a modern, multicultural democracy. The story of Britain, from prehistoric settlers to post-war citizens, is one of resilience and reinvention. Across centuries, invasions, plagues, wars, and revolutions, the people of the Isles adapted, endured, and transformed. Their history is both local and global, rooted in the soil of their villages and yet extending to the far corners of the earth. By 1945 and beyond, the nation had entered a new chapter, not of conquest, but of rebuilding, reform, and reflection. It was not the end of history, but the beginning of a new journey, as Britain sought its place in a world forever changed. And so, our journey through the history of Britain draws to a close. From the icy landscapes of the last ice age to the rebuilt streets of post-war London, we have wandered across millennia of stories. We have watched tribes gather by rivers, Roman legions march across hills, Saxon villages rise and fall, Norman castles pierce the skyline, and factories churn smoke into the skies of the Industrial Revolution. We have stood amid the thunder of cannon at Trafalgar, the silence of plague-struck villages, and the hum of factories powering a new age. We have seen monarchs crowned, parliaments forged, and ordinary men and women endure hardship, resilience, and renewal. Now, the long sweep of centuries quiets, and we step back from the bustle of events. History, after all, is not only about battles and kings, but about time itself, the patient passage that carries people from dawn to dusk, generation to generation. Across every age, the people of these isles tilled the soil, raised families, whispered stories by firelight, and dreamed of better days. The rhythms of their lives, humble or grand, have shaped the identity that endures today. As you lie back now, let the echoes of their journey soften into calm. Imagine the gentle hush of waves brushing the English coast, the steady toll of a village church bell across green fields, the distant call of gulls above a harbour. Let the centuries fade like footsteps receding down a quiet lane, until only the present moment remains still, safe, and peaceful. Rest in the knowledge that the story continues, even as we pause here. Tomorrow will have its own chapters, but tonight you may drift easily into sleep,